Hello and welcome to the Tuesday, April 6th meeting of the Finance Committee. Pursuant to the Governor's order suspending certain provisions of the Open Meeting Law, General Laws Chapter 30A, Paragraph 20, as well as the Select Board's emergency order dated March 16th, 2020, the Finance Committee will be using remote participation for this meeting. The audio of this meeting is being recorded and will be posted to the town's webpage within 24 hours in accordance with the Governor's emergency action requirement of keeping the public informed of actions during this meeting. I would ask that all participants remotely attending this meeting please state your name for identification purposes each time you speak throughout the meeting. At this time, I will take a roll call of the Finance Committee attendance. Mr. Alford.
Here.
Mr. Maxwell.
Here.
Ms. Zemer.
Here.
Ms. Nersessian.
Here.
Mr. Whitaker.
Here.
And Mr. Murphy.
Here.
Okay, I declare us convened at 7:02 p.m. Okay, first up on the agenda is the minutes. We have two sets of minutes. Mark sent those out earlier. I did find one very minor thing, or actually two very minor things, but they're things we can vote. We don't have to hold up the vote for, and I will pull up one of them. One was on the 23rd, the minutes of the 23rd, and this is just a grammatical correction, right? In the paragraph where the correction was in Vin's correction, about one, two, three sentences in, it says Mr. Murphy specifically noted that the towns selected, that shouldn't be possessive towns, that should be lowercase towns, plural, selected by the governance committee. Just a minor grammatical nit. Other than that, I had no problems with that. Anybody have anything else on the 23rd while we're, okay? And then the other one was the last week's 3:30. I don't know if everybody had a look at that. But the only other thing is that I want to correct is that I gave, let's see, where did I put that, Mark? The reference that I was telling you about earlier.
It's fairly far down. It's in the Travis section, the TA administration section, the TA section.
Okay. I had, let's see, I'm looking for the damn acronym and I can't find it. Did we take it out? Efforts. Oh no, it's the very bottom. Okay, where I had given Mark inaccurate information. It's ARPA for the stimulus bill. So I looked up the official name just to make sure we had the acronym right, but I gave him the wrong info. It's actually, what is it, the American something, and well, whatever. I know what it is. It's ARPA. So
I just have one grammatical thing on the 30th too.
Yeah,
under teachers, should be teachers apostrophe S union, as opposed to teachers union.
Where was that?
Under budget review, second paragraph, and Louise, blah, 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 negotiations with the teachers union should be apostrophe S.
Oh, it's interesting. I guess you could go either way with that, but yes, I see what you're saying. It's the union of the teachers.
Correct.
But it's a teachers, like not specific teacher. You see what I mean? Like teachers union, like you would say something like auto workers union, right? You don't say auto worker apostrophe S as far as I know. But anyway, I'm fine with that correction, so it doesn't matter anyway. Okay, so if everybody's fine with those two, and then I'll entertain a motion. Oh, three, that's right, those three. I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes of February 23rd and March 30th, 2021.
I make a motion to approve the minutes stated.
As amended, sorry.
As amended, yes.
Second.
Okay, any further discussion on those two sets of minutes? Okay, hearing none, we'll proceed to a vote. Mr. Alford?
Yes.
Mr. Maxwell?
Yes.
Ms. Zemer?
Yes.
Ms. Nersessian?
Yep.
Mr. Whitaker?
Yes.
Mr. Murphy?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Okay, that approved. So now we should be, I think, at this point, all caught up, right, Mark?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. That's good to know. Okay, so next up, I don't think there's any other administrative issues unless anybody has them. If so, raise your hand, but I don't see any up. We'll move right along to the next thing on our agenda, which are updates from Travis. So take it away, Travis.
All right, so I talked to Chair earlier about a few things to cover, but at the same point, I think you're going to get into 22. So
Yes.
let me focus then on FY21. Sharon Emmerich sent to the group today the preliminary Q3 updates for revenue and expenditures. As they came out today, I think we could certainly get into further discussion next week, but if there's any questions on that at the moment, we can answer it, or I can get into them. Revenues, I think, we've had a couple conversations. There have been some specific revenue sources within local receipts that we could probably pinpoint and say have been affected by COVID. But as a bottom line, especially due to the building department, what has been a very crazy sort of unpredicted run on building permits, the overall sort of revenue sources have evened out at the very least. On the expenditure side, we can, although I'm remembering that last year on my son's birthday in the end of April, there was a snowstorm, we are at a point where we can say relatively definitively that our snow and ice budget ended up $128,000 over. And we can discuss the best way to handle that. Obviously, the $790,000 in reserve fund is one potential option there. So with that, Sharon sent it out today, and I was doing other things. But if anybody had a chance to look at it, we want to get into it now. Otherwise, we could certainly put it as a Q3 sort of in-depth update next week. Looks like there's a hand. So before I move on,
Mr. Alfred?
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to spend a ton of time with it, but I'm happy to sort of make it a budget item or make it an agenda item next week. But is there anything on spending that stuck out to you that where we're over, significantly over or under spending, where we wouldn't expect it?
So the snow and ice is the one that, doesn't have an obvious source outside of its own budget. As we look at bottom line budgets, I think we'll probably be, in the next couple of weeks, looking at how internally there may be some moving between lines, things that I think we've discussed, quite frankly, through the Q2 update. I don't think there's anything shocking. The only one that I think you also became aware of through the budget process as it relates to the Water Enterprise Fund is that an entire body was left out of the FY21 budget for Water Enterprise. At the moment, I don't see that as an issue. But it's going to be close. And if, again, what I would look to do there, we will have unpaid bills as a warrant article on the warrant. We will have transfers on the warrant in the event that we feel like it is going to be close. Revenues on water are significantly above where the budget was set. So if we did need to add something to make that budget whole, the water budget, it would be from water surplus and would not cause any significant issues, but at the moment, we're hoping that we're projecting to get in under without needing that. Otherwise, no, I don't have anything that sort of we haven't previously discussed.
Thanks.
Okay. Anything else, Travis?
No, so that's on that. Again, if you want, we can sort of go in depth and ask Sharon if she can be with us next week if we want to get into it. I think we can start to also put together remotely rather than on an agenda item what we're looking at for potentially having any budget adjustments within departments so that there's no less surprises, more planning. I think than I heard the feedback on last year at the end of the year.
Yeah.
So with that, I also sent, and it might have been this morning or it might have been yesterday when I sent an update. No, because I sent the update last night at like 10 o'clock and then I forgot that I wanted to put on a sheet. This is a warrant article balance sheet that, the town accountant always keeps, and I can pull it up here. But the town accountant sort of always keeps this information. I think it's information that would be helpful to add to the warrant for any viewer. This is the format. Again, I'll mention that it's a draft form because one of the numbers that we have on here is through March 31st, which is generally speaking a number that we want to sort of track balances, but those things can be sometimes fungible. And so just to sort of highlight the way that this works is these are previously approved warrant articles, the article number and the town meeting that they were approved in. The original budget amount is in this column, and then this would be essentially what's in Munis, the accounting platform within the fiscal year. I did do a little bit of editing just for the the reader's perspective, right? The account numbers over here would place town hall doors in separate areas of the sheet if you do that. But obviously that was two appropriations for the same purpose, and we are going to come in just about under that budget based on the contract. It's then put into sort of departments that requested it. Although again, the select board ends up being, pretty much a catch-all as it is in some areas elsewhere. So this is helpful. Obviously, if you're looking at one that was just approved in December, it's possible that, there has been no billing yet. But I think this is, especially as there are two articles that I'll discuss shortly that will call on balances that were previously approved to fund sources, so that we're not looking at new tax dollars, but we're looking at a funding source that was previously approved. And I'll give you one example in a second. I think this information is especially helpful to have in the warrant. So the one that I'm referring to, and we can get into when we talk about the warrant structure at the moment is, and let me just find it here, the town hall septic. So I think everybody will remember the conversation is related to that. The $150,000 was based on a projection for the cost of the replacement of the septic system if we needed to stay only on our land, which was going to require a pumping out up the back at a very steep angle, which over the life of it was going to add a number of pumps rather than gravity. Not great for an energy use standpoint. Not great for then maintaining those pumps and those types of things. What we were able to do after that December 5th town meeting was come to an agreement with the First Congregational Church next door. So the actual septic tanks and the equipment will be on the town hall property, but as you need square footage for leaching fields and those types of things, that we came to an agreement with the church to utilize the corner of their property. And that there's a dollar value associated with that, as it's essentially valuing land, that we're able to put on the easement as an article on this warrant, accomplish the amount of money that we agreed to with the First Congregational Church, taking out of this original $150,000 balance to accomplish it, leaving enough money for the project, which I believe is a better project for the town, in that we would end up with a gravity-based system. This is a conversation I've had ongoing with the liaisons, Michelle and Ken. So I'm very excited that was the outcome, but I think also, understanding where that money is going to come to fund it, because there is a financial component to it, is again important to understand, the balance of the warrant articles and those things. The other one that I would just mention, and I hate to pop the screen, but I just want to, so the other one,
leave it up this time because I have a couple of questions. Good.
Okay, I will leave it up. The other one is the traffic signal preemption and monitoring. The description of this one, and I had a conversation, I think, it was a complicated item previously, which I understand, but the balance of that is $21,000. The way it was written is a pretty good comparison to sort of the equipment that TAC is currently requesting. I think one of the things, that has been discussed is that we need to get to the desired and long-term format of how TAC requests will come through. Right now, the warrant article has been the primary mode of funding these things, whether it's going to be a budget or whether it's going to be something, more consistent throughout the year. At the moment, the requests that they have, line up very well with the way that this previous article is written. Now, I would not make the case that we would just charge it there right now. Again, the wording of the previous article lines up with their request now, but as TAC was sort of being created at the time that this was approved, I would sort of make the case that what we should really do is put a new article on and just have this as the funding source, so town meeting has the ability to essentially say yes or no to the request, understanding that the funding source is not new tax dollars, it is these tax dollars. It is these previously approved dollars, and then also, if there is no interest in approving that this money would essentially flow to free cash, as these articles do when they have a balance that is no longer utilized. One of the questions that came up that I just want to sort of highlight as it relates to this list is, on an annual basis, town accountant will go to the department heads at the end of the year, essentially say, here's your previously approved article, here's everything you've accomplished, here's a balance. If you still need this balance, even though you've almost entirely completed the project, you need to justify that to the town accountant. Otherwise, it will be released. Oftentimes, there are things to close out the project, that sort of punch list items, if you will. The department head will make the case to leave it open. There is no actual mechanism to sunset it, so it is on the town accountant to close it out in her year-end process with the auditors. So those two, I believe at the moment, will interface with articles on the May town meeting warrant. And so I think, one, this is a good document to have included because I think it's important information. And two, I think it's important to sort of link to the funding sources of articles that we'll discuss separately. So,
Okay, Mr. Alfred?
Yeah, so just a couple questions. So is it your anticipation that any other use for this money would still go through town meeting? That it wouldn't, because you're going to bring the TAC request and and the funding source will be this warrant article, right? It wouldn't just be that you would spend directly out of this warrant article on that.
No, I would not reauthorize the old warrant article. I would create a new warrant article expressly explaining what TAC is looking for and identify the fact that these previous dollars that were left from this request that had a relatively similar function would be the funding source for this. If the TAC requests were not approved, then the previous warning article would have that balance, and then at the end of this fiscal year, town accountant would ask if there's anything left to be done, and if there wasn't, then it would flow to free cash.
Right, but I think last night at the select board meeting there was a discussion. I don't remember who brought up that in theory certain things may fit under new requests, may fit under old requests, under old warrant articles, under the purposes of those, and that there you could in theory use those to just purchase it without town meeting sort of.
I think you may
misunderstand.
Yeah, I think we're conflating two things. So one of them is at December 20th town meeting, there was a TAC request that included sort of multiple components, one of which was the equipment that's going to allow the police to sort of, track traffic counts and those types of things, collect data on traffic behavior internally. But there was another component within that was $4,500 that was based on 30 signs to answer requests such as the deaf child signs that they're currently sort of have put in front of the select board that have come through the TAC process. So within those 30 signs at $150 a sign, which was $4,500 within that article, they have 3 signs that would hit that $4,500. This is something else entirely, and I think we had this conversation previously that signs is becoming a little bit confusing in this regard because the equipment that they're asking for now, the reason it's more closely related to signal preemption is that the signs are the ones where as you approach they flash to cross at like a school.
Right, they're electronic crosswalks.
Electronic crosswalks.
Yeah.
And so I think if that's what you're referring to, they're looking at the signs specifically for TAC requests, one of them being the deaf child signs that they would use out of that 4,500.
No, I just wanted to make sure that we're not going back to old warrants and trying to fit something new to be spent through those appropriations. Rather, going back to town meeting with a new warrant article and using this as a source is fully appropriate because then that's open and transparent to the town. It's just where the money's coming from, right? And
the idea is to make the paper trail very clear.
Perfect. I would, as a side, I mean, we haven't, but if Mary Greendale's article passes the town meeting, I would love to see included in that what the town as a whole, when we're discussing, the vision of the town is how many signs the town wants to have in town as part of that visioning, because that would be interesting to me. But my other question was on the 1750 roof replacement. So line 3. That's a 2.5-year-old article that has a pretty significant balance. Is that one that you think is going to be freed up, or is there more? Is there something else left for that to be done? A roof replacement to me is something that's done and then it's over.
Yeah, I'll be honest. One of the things I'd like to add to this spreadsheet before it goes in is just a very quick blurb on the ones that are sort of still ongoing and why they would be. I don't want to put James Keast on the spot, but he would be involved in adding that narrative. I don't want it to be a very long paragraph on each thing. It would probably just be, this intends to be closed out. This is still open for this reason. As it relates to the 1750 roof replacement, James, if you're on and you want to hop in on that, otherwise I'll just get that information back to you soon.
Yeah, I'm on. No, that's left over. Those funds are available roll over to free cash or wherever they go. So
Okay, so that'll be free to be. It was one of the ones that stuck out to me because it was an older one. I was actually surprised that there wasn't much older on here, so that's really good. But it was just one of the older ones with a pretty significant balance. So I just wanted to know. And Travis, it's great because I think a little bit of explanation will reduce the questions. And if it's something like this, and it's over a balance will be closed out and will fall to free cash, and that's a perfectly acceptable answer.
Right. So I would also give Sharon a lot of credit. As I think you mentioned, there's not a lot of really old ones on here, and in other towns I've worked for, there certainly were. Sharon is pretty aggressive, and the person who would have to make the case to maintain the 1750 roof replacement balance after this year closes out would be James. It sounds like he's not prepared to make that case, so I would assume that it flows to free cash.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's great.
Yes, I did kudos to Sharon too, and also point out that part of the reason, Sharon obviously has been diligent about this, but this also correlates a lot with we do, she does it every year, but we take kind of an in-depth look every few years, and that, so I think that this is reflective of the fact that it was about 3 years ago when we did the last major purge, so it probably lines up with that.
Well, I'll just make one more point since I just noticed it. I put this asterisk here. This one, you can see it starts with an original balance of $25,000, but the beginning balance of this fiscal year is significantly higher. So that's the one where the reserve fund was added. So that's another one where, context is important to add into a narrative. So I will do that.
Okay, well, the ones that I had, my comment was just on similar to Dan's on some of these when I was looking at it. For example, like the trash and recycling cart one. I know there's some expense there, but that article itself was originally intended to fund the initial purchase of all the trash carts when we switched to automated trash collection. So in essence, that should have been closed out, as soon as everybody got their cans. If it's being used now for additional, purchases of other things, then you may, not something we have to deal with tonight, but I'm saying something you may want to reconsider reauthorizing something more appropriate for a replacement fund or something, because as I said, the original thing was we're buying this many carts at this much price and this is going to be the cost. So
it did come up as I've sort of poured in through a lot of this. One of the things is that we've had a couple just new house built, and they come to the town clearly within the guidelines, receive trash service, obviously, goes into new growth and they're paying their taxes and falls within the guidelines. And so we've actually charged it, provide them those and charged it there. Now you're right. I mean, those are few and far between. We're not just having houses pop up all over the place. So, sort of looking at it and deciding whether or not we want to roll it or reauthorize it for a purpose of sort of replacement, which again falls into the category of, replacement does end up on the homeowner at some point. And then we'll be at the end of this 5-year contract relatively soon in the grand scheme of things as well.
Yeah. Mr. Murphy, you had your hand up.
Yeah, since I love to talk about trash, but yeah, shouldn't it be something like a regular budget line under trash removal? We have the replacement, but for new homeowners.
Solid waste, you mean?
Yeah, as opposed to having it through the CapEx. I mean, I concur with Ken completely. It's not something that should be still out there. I think of just having a regular line. And then you're right, we do have this contract that's going to be ending. Assuming we keep them, then, it makes perfect sense to put a line item in the budget under there and just this is where the carts are going for any new homeowners, or we create a revolving fund, something to that effect. But
the only problem with the revolving fund is I don't think there's any revenue.
Right. So then we'd have to charge it. So I think the budget line as an expense would make more sense than having it as this outstanding $67,000 or whatever it's still left. So.
Okay. The other thing I was just in general going to comment on was there are several projects, and again, I'm not expecting you to have answers tonight, Travis, right? We just saw this. This is just kind of a comment on something to follow up on later, right? There are a couple of articles in there like the dam work, right? And things like that I think need to, not so much for us, but I think for the town would be good to, give some progress reports on, simply because at the time, I can tell you over the years I've been on the finance committee, we've passed several, we've recommended and the town has approved several expenditures for dam inspections, dam monitoring, dam this, dam that, the whole dam bills. Paul Bowe and I used to have great pun jokes all the time about dams, but now we have this dam project. We meaning the town, right, was basically told that the dam situation, we had them inspected. There were some that were in disrepair. There was probably going to be an expense associated with repairing some of them, and then it just seems to drop off the map. And then every few years comes back and says, well, now we need, right? So I looked at that and saw that nothing had been expended from one of those lines. And I was like, okay, so what happened to the dams, and part of the reason I'm bringing that up and saying, that's why I said I think you need to follow up is because there was a time where we were talking about a potential significant expense to the town to deal with the dams. And
So
I don't want that to come out of nowhere,
Yeah, so Matt Zedek, Ryan Clapp, and myself have looked at that. We have, this money is going to go relatively quickly, and it's really an issue of, compliance is the first thing. We have dams that need to be inspected every 2 years. Once we initiate that, the compliance component is going to essentially be a relatively basic report that says, yeah, it's still in the same relative shape and needs to be inspected every 2 years, right? So there's that. The next step most likely is going to be rolling that forward also into potentially looking at hopefully MVP money to look beyond the sort of very basic compliance required inspection reports. And for that, the town used to have volunteer dam inspectors. That position is currently vacant. So, Matt, Ryan, and myself have sort of formed that team, although, we've relied relatively heavily, and I'm very thankful for the willingness of the past dam inspectors to make sure that we have all the information. So I would say that, yes, the progress report certainly is due on this one. At the same point, the money is going to go relatively quickly once we're in compliance with inspection reports. And it's really going to be the next step of, if the town wants to look at removing dams, that is a very long process that, certainly we can start now, but is not going to happen in the next 5 years, as a conservative time frame. And then beyond that, if some of these things come into regional topics of one of especially Winthrop, one of the components of the previous article that was listed on this one is ownership. The reason for that was sort of determining, because of the Great Pond classification, whether we actually own Lake Winthrop Dam. And, I think we can sort of settle that without necessarily putting out consulting fees. But at the end of the day, anything that's done with that is going to be in concert with the state, who says, we don't own it, you own it, but don't do anything because we kind of own it. So, it's messy, but number one is compliance. So this money will start to go out. We actually just sat on this yesterday, and it's going to be an issue of Lennard is the company that has previously done all these reports, sort of on the 2 to 3 year cycle, depending on the classification of the dam. There are other groups that do it. We just wanted to make sure we were doing our due diligence before signing up for another round here, and we feel like we're in a good place to initiate that now.
Okay, yeah, because you hit on a couple of things that I was concerned about. One was the ownership. I know there was a question about ownership of, the state said we had 6 dams. We only thought we had 3 or something like this. There's always been this ownership question, right? But just to clarify, right? Yes, there's the issue of dam removal, but some of them, I at least the way the information was relayed to us in the past was that some of them are in bad shape. And it wasn't even a question of removal. It was a question of, are we going to be in a situation where they get inspected and we have to, put $500,000 into replacing one of them, So, again, it's not something we're going to answer tonight, but I just wanted to highlight that was always one of the expenses on our radar of we might have a big dam expense coming at some point, and it's kind of always been out there in this kind of nebulous state. So I think it is important to understand, as you said, settle the ownership question, settle the inspection question as to what the state is in, but also figure out what our long-term plan is there, right? Is it going to be that we're going to remove some of them or whatever, or is it going to be that, how many more years do we have left? because the concern originally was portrayed as, hey, you don't have much time left. You got to be prepared to replace these things. And obviously that hasn't happened. So now it's, 5-10 years later. And I'm just wondering, is it still on the horizon that they're going to inspect it 1 year and say, hey, this is getting a grade of F and it has to be taken care of, that kind of thing. So again, as I said, you can follow up later. I don't want to spend our whole meeting talking about the dams, but you see where I'm going with that. And just in general with that list, that's kind of what I would say is, I think it's excellent that Sharon does what she does to follow up. But I do think that with some of these, she's doing the right thing by saying, hey, justify why you still need it open. But I also think that, related to that would also be kind of updates for you as the town administrator, right? To provide in the reporting of, hey, these articles are closed out in the sense that the work that was paid for or the request that was made to the town was funded, the work's been completed, and so we expect it to be closed out. Just to keep it current like that, because there are these things like the cards, like the dams and things like that, where I think we do need somebody, and that's obviously you, to make sure that it's not just someone saying to Sharon, yeah, there's still more work to be done, and the project's not stalled. So, anyway, enough on that. Anybody have any more questions about the article summary? Okay. Anything else, Travis, under updates?
So it's really about the warrant in general. The list, I kind of need to assign numbers. What I have is a draft that I sent off to council for review. Once I get that, I can send out the language to most people on articles. The structure of the warrant right now, I have 37 articles. I think the financial components for 3 that work with, my overall budget picture that was presented last night. If you want me to go into that now or after you go through your model.
Yeah, we'll go through that when we do the FY22 stuff.
Okay. Then the only other 2 things I would do as an update would be that last night, Article 15 from the December 5th town meeting, which was the traffic study on a number of streets in town, including South Street, came in, was presented by Michael Pompili from McMahon. I think, the data to a certain extent was compelling to the sort of narrative that we've heard from residents in the Lowland Industrial Park area, that they've hit certainly the warrants of a heavy commercial vehicle exclusion on a number of side streets. We knew that on Woodland, and we needed the data on 24-hour counts rather than 12. We have those counts now on Bullard Street again, which is sort of ended up being a cross street for a lot of trucks coming from Framingham through town. But then South Street, quite frankly, I was blown away. I was concerned. If you stand on South Street, you understand why you shouldn't have a heavy truck on there. It literally can't fit in the lane. But to hit 14% over a 24-hour period, that's above the 5 to 8% you need to have the conversation with Mass DOT on a heavy commercial vehicle exclusion. Medway, and that's also one that, quite frankly, as you look at the heavy commercial vehicle exclusion is from an enforcement standpoint, from a number of signs standpoint, that, to Dan's earlier point on signs is, on either end of that street, it's not going to require a lot to sort of say this is a street, if Mass DOT were to approve it, that we don't want trucks cutting through on. We want you to stay on the state number routes. It requires Medway to be on board, which they have indicated they are, and they'll support an application for. Does not require too much signage, and the enforcement, I think, will be relatively easy. So that data came back. Like I said, South Street was the one that clearly stood out, although it's it's sort of just supported a major component of why that article existed on the warrant to begin with. And the rest of it is sort of to be determined by applying to Mass DOT to see if they'll approve a heavy commercial vehicle exclusion on a number of streets. I'm going to pause there because I see a hand up.
Yep. Go ahead, Mr. Alfred.
Yeah, so that was the most exciting part of this, is that we're going to get a lot more signs in town. But all kidding aside, no, South Street obviously makes a lot of sense. There's nothing around there that really would require a truck that's clearly being used for a cut through to get to 495 or to get off 495. But my concern, and from a financial perspective, is the sort of the woodland lowland area where there is an industrial park. Realize that there is a sort of a path where that they're supposed to take, but I just want to make sure that we're checking in with businesses and making sure that we're not, Holliston does not have a reputation for being the most business friendly community already, and we're sort of I just want to make sure that we're being good neighbors and doing what we can to make sure that we talk to businesses if they're willing and try to sort of make sure that it will not impact them a lot. There on Woodland Street, there is obviously companies with large trucks, and I realize that local traffic would be excluded from it, which doesn't help with the enforcement. But hopefully, a lot of those companies have pretty clearly marked vehicles anyway, and I'm sure the local police, our fine police will learn which are the right trucks and not bother them. But anyway, that would be my one thing. I just want to make sure that, again, we're not.
Yeah, so just to the point on businesses, I did speak to a business today. They wanted to sort of know what the signs would look like, to your sign point, and Chief Stones raised his hand, so he could probably
I'll get to him in a minute.
enforcement much better than I can. But, and so at the end of the day, you're right. I mean, the business side of this, and I've tried to hammer this point home as much as possible so that there is not an expectation that trucks will not be seen. As it relates specifically to Woodland, one of the biggest users of trucks on that street is our school. At the end of the day, and Mass DOT will hammer this point home, as we will as well, if you are doing business on a street, you are exempt from the exclusion. And I'm going to go silly trying to repeat over and over that you are exempt from the exclusion. But at the end of the day, that's the case, right? You are not exempt from any. You cannot be excluded from any road if you're doing business on that road. And so the signage will indicate that. One of them things that they'll say is, sort of no trucks. And I actually, they just sent me the sign earlier that's MUTCD approved that indicates that if you are doing local business. But for the enforcement, I would say.
And I guess my question would be, I understand enforcement is one of these things where, it's just like speeding, right? I mean, it's you don't do it. You don't do what's not allowed. But my question is, how will the local police know necessarily every truck that's local?
Well, let's let the chief say, or he just lowered his hand, but let's let him say what he wanted to say. So Matt, you want to chime in here?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Similar to what I said last night, I think a big part of our enforcement strategy and the implementation of all this is going to be education at first. So we're going to have to teach the drivers to go a different way, bottom line. Obviously, it will be a little bit easier on South Street. Woodland Street will be a little bit of a challenge at first, but I think as soon as we change behavior and teach trucks and commercial traffic, this is the suggested route, this is what's been recommended, it's going to take some time. Our resources are limited in terms of enforcement 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and so forth. But I think overall education and then to enforcement, I think we can do a good job with that.
But I guess my point was, what about the trucks that are supposed to be there? And obviously there's some like Holliston Oil and stuff, which will be very clear that that's where they belong. But others may not be. And I just are we going to end up pulling over people that are supposed to be there and sort of doing?
Well, I think that's the education part he's talking about, right? Is that early on they're probably going to talk to the local businesses to make sure they understand, and then probably when they are stopping the first few trucks, I'm guessing they're going to, if they're supposed to be there, they're going to be okay, but they're going to educate them on what the new rules are.
So similar when we implemented the traffic changes in Mudville with the no right-hand turn between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. That took a while for folks that use Mudville as a cut-through area to get to their work or place of business quicker. We had to educate those drivers. Listen, there's no right-hand turn between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. Over time, those issues have reduced. We will certainly reach out as part of our community interaction to the businesses on Woodland Street and in Lowland Street and advise them. So listen, if you have truck drivers coming or going at a certain time, advise them that they're going to be probably subject to a conversation with us and say, either we're using the business, we're not using the business. Over time, if you're not using Holliston, if you're not using the Lowell Industrial Park, those drivers will learn we have to use the state highway. So it's going to take a matter of time to get these drivers educated.
But it's education from with your officers as well, right? I mean, just as far as, because there will be trucks that were supposed to be there and they may not all be marked well. But
Well, I wouldn't worry about that, Dan. I mean, I'm just saying that, Chief knows what he's doing. So let's let him work, let him handle it. But the only thing that I want to say is I just hope that it ends up being done the right way to make sure the traffic goes where it's supposed to, which is Jeffrey Avenue, I guess, is the way they're supposed to get from 16 to Lowland. And, I just hope that it doesn't push traffic onto, the other streets like Fisk and so forth. I don't think it will, but, anyway, it's not our purview. So, Mr. Murphy, you had a question?
Yeah, I just have a question regarding, this is only a one-day kind of account. Will that support doing anything with the state? I mean, is that sufficient? I would think just me from a statistical standpoint, one day could be an aberration. Maybe there was some construction going on. That's why you had a whole bunch of dump trucks. I'm guessing dump trucks just because of 2-axle and 6-tire. So does the state require more than just one day?
No, this is the requirement.
Okay.
In fact, we had data, and I think this came up in the article request conversation, was that we had data from a permit application in the Lowland area on Woodland that was 12-hour counts. The Woodland was supported by a number of factors, including safer use of schools, rail trail crossings, and those types of things that lead to pedestrians in the area. But what they did say is you're going to need the 24-hour counts, which is why it got rolled in here, even though the application had been started. As it relates to South Street, I think the point that was made, or the other streets in general, the 24-hour count is sort of the quote-unquote warrant, another use of the word warrant in municipal government. There are warrants to go through the heavy commercial vehicle exclusion process with Mass DOT, and the 24-hour counts is the standard. And then there's a number of other items that we need to tick off as it relates to the application, and the alternate route is the biggest thing that we sort of, and why the consultant is very helpful as well. As it relates to South Street, the alternate route goes through Medway. That's why, they're going to support the application. As it relates to many of these other ones, it is the intention to essentially stay, if you are not doing business on one of these side streets, we expect you to stay on the state number routes and not cut through the side streets to avoid lights on 16 or 126.
Okay, Michelle?
I'm sorry, I can't get my hand raised to work. The Woodland Street, I know we do business sometimes on like Lowland or Jeffrey Ave, and the GPS takes people down Bullard Street to Fisk Street. Is a Woodland Street exclusion going to increase traffic on Fisk Street?
So one of the components and one of the reasons it's important, I think, these were all tied together as it related to the December town meeting of being able to sort of track this information and have the capacity to do so, is, the sign that sort of is going to allow us to track behavior changes here. I will say that Fisk and Bullard, we have the counts on as well. That's included in the data that I had sent to you. They were part of the study because they're all sort of interconnected, to your point. What we want to make sure, and within the application and part of the alternate route, is to make sure that, we're thinking holistically here, and not doing a whack-a-mole, I think was Ben Sparrow's phrase, where, you stop them over here and they pop up over here. So it's all sort of part of it. Bullard and Fisk were part of that same analysis and will be part of the same conversation with DOT. At the end of the day, DOT may come back and say, no, but that's all part of it.
Okay, thank you.
Just to be clear, Travis, right? While there's a financial component to this, we're just more curiosity than anything that has our jurisdiction over it, right? It's obviously not our issue, except when it comes to the signs and the cost of the signs. So
yeah, no, and I mean, look, these are recent articles that we just passed in December. Right? I mean, this is really sort of the coming to fruition of what those conversations were. So
yeah. Okay. Anything else, Travis?
No, warrant. So I can wait.
Okay, we'll wait on that. Okay. Okay, so liaison updates, nothing. Okay, well, I'll get to, go ahead, Tim, go ahead.
Sorry, I did get an update. Ken, you probably were on the same email from Chief Stone about them likely needing a line item transfer later this year to cover several shortages. Just wanted to pass it along to the committee.
Yeah. Yeah, we got that. Yeah, Chief Stone sent email. And in fact, I guess I could forward it to the whole committee. I have to I saw that, but I didn't go through it in great detail. But yes, so there's an early alert at a possible, although I think, and Chief's here so he can answer, I think his email referred to, he thinks it won't be necessarily reserve fund, it'll be line item, right? That's the plan right now. So just to be clear to everybody. So he's not looking for additional money at the moment. He's just saying that they might have to shuffle things around in their budget. So, okay, what I was going to say, okay, thank you, Matt. What I was going to say was, as you know, when we talked to the schools last week, they had the conversation about they have to do work on their end from the budget. We were supposed to have a budget subcommittee meeting tomorrow, but I haven't seen it posted, so I'm guessing that we're not having one. So I had hoped to get back to that. Go ahead, Travis.
Now that I'm done with my TA update, I just got a stipend committee reconvened and put together a revised report and would like to be on the Select Board and Finance Committee meetings coming up. So
okay, I'll put them on. I'll contact Jane about that. I mean, Joan. What am I saying, Jane? It's funny because I have a cousin who's named Jane Sousa, so I can always get them. She used to be Sousa, Shaughnessy, but so I'm constantly messing that up. So my apologies to Joan. But yes, I'll contact Joan and follow up with that. Okay. So let's see. Okay. So liaison updates. I was about to say we don't have, and since Anne Louise is here, I can ask her. I think we were supposed to meet tomorrow, but that's not happening, obviously, because it's not posted. So do you have any? You don't have to give anything because I know you can't speak on behalf of the whole committee if you haven't met. But I'm just saying, do you have any plans for when the next time we're going to get together is?
We have to reset the calendar because we don't have any new information. We had hoped to have new information that we could have discussed in budget subcommittee tomorrow. We don't, but our mediation has been pushed out until the 28th of April. Unfortunately, the HFT can't meet until then, but I'm happy to have a subcommittee meeting prior to that because it looks like some of the town numbers may have shifted a bit. So if that's worth discussing, then we can certainly do that. But it won't be tomorrow because I have to post, of course. So it'll probably have to be early next week.
Okay. Yeah, we'll have the conversation about the numbers a little later in this meeting. So, okay. Any other liaison updates from the committee? No, I don't see any hands up. Okay, so we'll move on. What was next? The COVID stuff. And I see Chief Cassidy. So make our meeting formal, Miss Chief Cassidy. He's always the best dressed one of us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not much to report. We had 11 additional expenses posted to Munis since your last meeting in the aggregate of about 4,000. No new requests came into the board last evening. I do have a couple that are percolating and will likely come before the board next week. And we continue to await the guidance from both U.S. Treasury as well as ANF on the ARPA.
Okay, so, and this may be for you or for Travis, but what is our town side running? Like we've talked to the schools and they've told us that it's about $85K a month that they're running in COVID-related expenses for cleaning and everything else. The town, last I heard, was running at around $25K a month. Is that still the case?
That is a good estimate of the additional cleanings that we're doing for the high touch and high traffic areas at municipal buildings, both that are open to the public as well as are just employee only.
Okay, so I'm just thinking, like, are we thinking about, I mean, I got the report, haven't looked at it in detail, but do we think we're set money-wise? Certainly, I think at $25K a month, right? It's April, so we have April, May, June, June, if we finish out the fiscal year. I think that's covered. But what kind of capacity, and I'm not saying it all goes to the schools, but what kind of capacity do we think we're going to have at the end of this? I know we can extend it to the end of the calendar year, but I'm saying if we looked at the fiscal year, do we have enough funds there to get us to the end of the fiscal year with COVID-related expenses if, for example, the schools needed help with some of theirs?
My projections do break it out to both within fiscal year 21 as well as the anticipated eligible expenses through the end of the calendar year, which would then be fiscal year 22. And it does sort of track the balance of what is yet to be obligated by the board.
Okay. Okay, yes, Michelle. Sorry, I was just checking my notes.
What additional expenses are going to be incurred at town meeting?
In terms of
Ventilation, additional cleaning, anything like that?
Right. So I'm still in conversations with the schools regarding what the requirements will be for the venue that we will be in. And I am due to report back to my board next week. And we would probably have a better handle on that as to whether or not we would be able to use an existing space that we've used before, or whether we might need to relocate to a different space that would either need additional ventilation or would need possibly AV equipment or projection equipment as well. So a lot's up in the air. I'll hope to know more within the next week.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Any other questions? I mean, I'll ask the obvious one that's not financial, which is how are we doing as a town COVID-wise?
So we're 10 weeks in the yellow, which is good, considering a couple of towns around us, towns or cities around us have popped into the red. The Commonwealth went from 32 communities in the red last week up to 55. Fortunately, we were not one of them. We did see a few more cases this week in multifamily dwellings. For several weeks, we had been confined only to single-family homes. We're continuing to monitor, and we're just anxiously awaiting more and more people getting the vaccine, because a super majority of our 65 to 74-year-olds and almost the entirety of our over 75-year-olds who are eligible have received the vaccine. So we do see light at the end of the tunnel, but of concern are the variants, both the UK variant, the P1 Brazil variant, the South African variant, and then there's now a new California variant that is of concern that is being watched by public health professionals.
Okay. Sue, you were first. Oh, actually, see, oh, wait, Dan was first. I have the order right this time.
Since would Dan mind if I just went first, because I was actually going to ask about the variants?
Yes. No, go ahead.
Is that okay? Okay. So, Chief, actually, I was wondering, has Holliston seen any of those variants that are being noted on the news as spreading quite quickly?
So initially, when the B117 variant, the UK variant, was being identified through testing, local boards of health were receiving calls from the Mass Department of Public Health epidemiologists letting them know that the variant had been identified in one of our samples. There is so much community spread of the UK variant right now that they are no longer making those individual calls. Just their assumption is the UK variant is here in the Commonwealth.
Okay.
You may have seen some local media coverage about the fact that Massachusetts is a pretty high location for the P1 Brazilian variant. There is an outbreak in Barnstable County, which accounts for the majority of those cases. So those departments have been notified of those individual Brazilian cases. The South African one is very, very rare. And so there haven't been notifications of that one taking place to a large extent. And what they said on the conference call today with local boards of health was that per CDC guidance, they're going to start to change to a different model. And instead of identifying individual cases with the variants, they're going to move to more of a surveillance model, whereby based on random sampling of the samples that go into the nationwide laboratories, they'll basically tell I don't think it'll get down to the community level. It will more likely be the county level through the state, and basically being told that X% of your cases are likely this variant. But they're going to be moving away from the individual notification of variants. We have not received notification of any of the variants of concern to date. And based on this change of the way they'll be reporting data, it sounds like we won't.
Okay. Even for the new one, the one that they were mentioning that came from India, that I guess.
The double variant in
Yeah.
California?
Yeah, exactly.
So this is very fluid, and things continue to change. And so what they tell us today may be different 2 weeks from now, and due to some overarching epidemiological concern, they may do individual notifications for certain variants. But right now, what they said is they're going to more of an overhead surveillance model, not individualized to specific cases.
Okay. And then just one last question. So for anyone who has had the vaccine, are there any known cases of someone getting one of these variants and having a severe reaction or death?
I haven't heard of severe reactions. There is what's referred to as breakthrough that occurs. So if someone who has had the complete vaccine series, and again, if it's Pfizer or Moderna, it's 2 shots and at least 14 days post second shot, or if it's the Johnson & Johnson, it's 14 days after the 1 shot, you're considered to be fully vaccinated. If someone then comes down with a positive PCR test, and that is considered to be a breakthrough case, and those are being tracked, and the different vaccines do have different efficacy levels against these variants. They're not, even with just the main underlying original thread of the coronavirus, none of them were 100% effective. But I haven't heard of anybody getting significantly sick as a result of the variants.
Okay, that's super helpful. Dan, thank you for letting me go first.
Sure, no problem. I think Pfizer just reported 6-month data from their control group that there were no hospitalizations in that group in 6 months or something like that. It was some pretty incredible.
Pfizer's headline was a little bit concerning to some individuals who were vaccine hesitant, whereby the headline just reads, Pfizer confirms that the vaccine lasts for 6 months. So some people were thinking, oh, great, I'm going to have to get a booster after only 6 months. And that wasn't the point of their study. And there have been a bunch of studies, both in Israel as well as here in the United States, that specifically use healthcare workers that studied how effective the Pfizer vaccine was in preventing serious illness and or hospitalizations.
Right. The Pfizer vaccine lasts at least 6 months. We know now. We don't know
Correct.
how long.
Yes.
Right. But also I think it is that there were no hospitalizations in the 6-month data that they have from their control group. Not to say everybody who got the Pfizer, but just the control group. That's what I read. But anyway. Yep. So maybe I missed this earlier. I apologize if it was mentioned. But what is the CARES Act balance right now that we have? Unexpended, unencumbered, free to be grabbed money?
That was sent in my email last night.
Oh, okay.
But sorry, go ahead, Chief. I just wanted to. Everybody has it in their email from that I sent.
Never characterize any balance as free to grab, Mr. Alford.
Okay, I can't hear Chief anymore.
Chief,
I would never characterize any balance as free to grab.
That was tongue in cheek for anyone listening.
I know it's not mine to give. Bringing up the spreadsheet right now, looking at the bottom line. We are looking at
248,542. Is that?
Yes, 248,542, I believe, through the end of the calendar year.
And that, just trying to see. Okay. And then my other question is, there are a lot of potentially contentious issues on the warrant. I don't want to say contentious. Items that may have great public interest. Do we have a sort of an idea of how many people it's going to be hard to say how many we think may be attending, and what are we doing to ensure that we can accommodate, because even if we reduce the quorum, that doesn't actually mean we can turn people away. You still have to, even if you have a reduced quorum of 10 people, you still have to be able to allow as many people who show up to show up, correct? There wasn't a change to that in the governor's
That's
order,
right.
right?
You can't turn people away.
Yeah, we can't disenfranchise people and turn them away if we reach capacity based on public health. So that's all part of my conversations with the school to make sure to identify spaces that anticipate a large influx of individuals who may be coming out to be heard on one or more specific articles, while at the same time making sure that we can meet the distancing requirements of the reopening guidelines of the state. So whether it's all in one space or, as we saw last July, if it's a primary space with an overflow capacity, these are the conversations that we need to have to make sure that we use the resources available to us most efficiently.
And the state was still requiring 6 feet of distancing?
That is the current guideline, yes, for non-household members.
So our children are 3 feet apart in the classroom, but for town meeting, we have to be 6 feet apart for a shorter period of time. Anyway, that's just my snarky remark. But I understand it's CDC guideline. Okay, so you're handling that so good. I just as long as I don't want to have a situation where we have so many people attend that it would be a good problem to have, but it's also a problem we don't want to have.
Yeah, no, and we are very aware of the fact that there are some articles of interest, and we want to make sure that if a large group come out to be heard, that they will have available seats.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, and thank you for your service as always.
Of course.
Okay. Any other questions for the chief, COVID related? There is one question that I wanted to ask, which was something that came out of a conversation that we had in one of our subcommittee meetings with the schools, a liaison meeting with schools, which is the lunch program, right? The lunch program that was, when the pandemic first hit and there was a shutdown, there was this whole program which has been continuing all year about the lunches being made available to people. And that was at one point, I don't want to claim that I know for sure, but if I recall correctly, it was something like it was funded out of some part of the CARES Act, not our CARES money, but some part of the CARES Act gave money to like the USDA to cover the costs of the school lunch program or something like that. And there's been some conversation that was raised up about whether that's continuing, because I think that from the school's perspective, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, they can obviously talk to you, Travis, separately, but I'm just wondering, I know they had some questions about deficits they're going to be running because I guess they're not getting reimbursed at the same rate, or they're not getting reimbursed at all, something where there might be a gap there with the school lunch program. Have you been talking to them about that, Travis, or do we know where that CARES fits into all that?
I would say, generally speaking, there are a number of eligible costs on the school side that could reasonably be charged to CARES. That point was brought up. I would equate that one similar to the way that the Council on Aging has run a service level that changed due to COVID that had additional costs, and we looked at. So have they specifically brought that as a CARES request? No. Am I aware of that? Yes.
Okay, because as I said, I think that the issue was that it was being covered through other aspects of the CARES Act, and I think so again, they can deal with that with you directly, but it's just one of these things where I just want to make sure that that's comprehended when we're talking about the remaining money. Go ahead, Michelle.
I think it wasn't just students. I think it was the community in general, wasn't it? Ann Louise can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, Ann Louise, you can, as I said, I don't want to speak.
I think that's just a good point for anybody who's watching. It wasn't lunch for students because we weren't actually serving lunch for students. Wish we could have. It was actually to support any family or citizen in town, and we began that last spring when it became apparent there might be families in need, significant need. And so we started it last spring. Frankly, with no funding, we covered it out of the school's reserves. And then FEMA started picking up the cost. If I understand correctly, I have to go back and check with Keith. And somewhere along the way, something changed with how FEMA was covering it. real sorry, dog in the kitchen. So in any event, Travis, that's a fair point. I think what we haven't voted a formal ask on that, but we do have a meeting tomorrow night. So that's a really good point. I will speak with the committee about this particular issue, and we'll determine how to handle that and potentially come back to you with a formal request that it be considered part of the CARES request or something. I don't know if it's CARES or not, because I know the CARES funds are limited, but I think it would qualify, but I'm just saying, I'm not sure that's how it gets funded or not. That would be something for the town to look at, but it was absolutely an expense for the town, something we're happy to do, but I think there's merit in looking at how else we can pay for that.
So as I said, that's a matter of, I'm just facilitating the schools talking to Travis about how this gets handled, but I just want to make sure it's on everybody's radar. That's all. So Travis, you're aware of it. So we'll let you follow up with the schools on that. But obviously that's something that from our perspective, even though we don't control the distribution of CARES money, we'd want to keep tabs on for our perspective in case there are reserve fund transfers or other things needed at the end of the year. So, okay. Anything else for Chief Cassidy before we move on? Okay, I don't see any other hands up, so we'll move on to next up on the agenda, which I think is our last item, which is obviously the big kahuna now, which is the FY22 budget. Now, before we start talking about this, I wanted to update the committee and kind of set the framework for everything. Okay, and I will share, for that purpose, I will share the spreadsheet I sent out to the committee earlier today. Let's see.
Ken, before we get to there, can I just make a request? After hearing Keith, I think at least I make this request every year. Could we look at different health insurance plans other than West Suburban after hearing how Keith saved money, doing something differently?
I think that's on Travis's radar, but I'll let Travis comment.
Yeah, so we did hire in FY21 Mary Busquet, myself, in conjunction really with the PEC, which is all the union representations that have a say in the healthcare that we sort of select. It's a difficult year. One of the things that we did, so we hired this woman, Sushalu, after I believe we got 5 responses to our RFP. She came very well recommended, and actually after we hired her, got unsolicited, sort of feedback that it was a great choice, and she's been great to work with. The issue that we ran into this year was, one, the most common way when we look at towns who've either left West Suburban or migrated in the past few years from a cost saving standpoint, but also, to maintain benefits, has been to go to the GIC. The GIC happened to be at the time, and this was a recommendation that Sue made for the employees and the town side, was to say, don't jump into the GIC boat at the moment. They have a change in leadership with a new executive director, and they have an upcoming vote that is going to potentially completely shake up the offerings that they have, and it's very hard to predict where they're going to be. So we comped it out. But again, we comped out something that was sort of very murky. Then the other recommendation from Sushalu was it is very risky on the town and employee side, because there was quite a bit of interest from the employees to say, why don't we go directly to a carrier? And I've been in a town where we were with a carrier and we ended up switching. And what happens when you're direct with a carrier in a town our size is that we have one bad year. And I think, I'm not going to get into what drives claims, but, you have one bad year with a couple people who have serious health issues, and all of a sudden they lose, $1 million on you, and you're direct with that carrier. They're coming for you that next year, and you're making up their $1 million and more. And so, Sue's recommendation, regardless of the fact that there were people on the PEC very interested in that because they'd seen it in other towns, said you really, it is a bad decision for this town to go direct with a carrier. So you need to find another type of consortium if you want to leave West Suburban. And what we ended up looking at, which comped out relatively well in a number of areas, was MIA. MIA is the Massachusetts Interlocal assurance agency. Anyway, the group that we use, the Massachusetts Interlocal Insurance Association, which is what we use as a town and most municipalities do on the liability insurance area. We looked at Maya, who's got into the game as it relates to health insurance and has done quite well for towns. It comped out relatively well on the active plans, that is the non-Medicare plans. It did not comp out well on the Medicare supplemental plans. And at the end of the day, we said, Maya may be a viable solution for us at the moment. There are not significant enough savings on the town side. And then there's the trepidation on the employee side as it relates to where Maya was with retiree benefits. And we said, look, at the moment, the GIC is not a viable option to look at. Maya is not going to provide the savings we're looking for at the moment. So we're going to stick with West Suburban Health Group. I think there's interest on the town side. I think there's interest on the employee side to look elsewhere outside of West Suburban. But this year didn't work out for that. And, one of the things that we trigger, we have 3-year agreements with the PEC. We're currently working on the updated one because it runs to the end of this June. Regardless of whether or not we extend the PEC agreement for 3 years with under the current assumption that we're staying with West Suburban, which we are because we're entering open enrollment, if there are any changes substantially that come from West Suburban, it triggers us sitting back at the table and looking at changes overall anyway. So I don't have a lot of fear that we're going to, just get into a rut over the next 3 years and be stuck with West Suburban if that's not what is in everybody's best interest. At the same point, we hired somebody to make recommendations. I thought she did a phenomenal job, and it wasn't a great time to go out to the market, but I'm glad that we did. I think we got a lot of information. One of the things that we're focusing on at the moment that I hope we can get done, and if we can't, again, it's going to be a timing thing. We have open enrollment starting at the end of April. We have non-union employees who have access to high deductible plans. We have union employees who don't. Because of the agreement from 3 years ago. If we can switch that, I think it can work out for everybody. But again, it takes, everybody sort of agreeing. So I'll report back on that, in the coming weeks. But at the end of the day, we are looking outside of West Suburban. And this year, unfortunately, there was not something that I could bring to the town and employees to say that, this is because if we find savings on the town side, the way that these agreements work is that it triggers mitigation where we share some of those savings with the employees, which requires that the option that we move to, and this is something that, Keith could speak to as well, is that we can lock in those savings, right? And Maya did not present that opportunity. The GIC was not an option to comp with, and going direct to a carrier, we think is just too risky for this town.
Thank you.
Okay. Dan?
Just a quick question. I know at one point there was a pretty significant sort of reserve or balance at the West Suburban Health Group. Is that still the case that we would lose that if our share of it anyway if we left?
It's a possibility. Honestly, my bigger thing is they because of the people who've left, they've put in policies where to make it more difficult for you to leave, where you have to make sure that and this is a conversation, quite frankly, the finance committee, the select board, the PEC would all need to have as a conversation together, because it takes it's a budgeting hit, and that's why they make it difficult. You end up having to pay essentially 15 months of premium or budget, extra months of premium, which is difficult to do. You need to essentially smooth it out over time, and you just need to be prepared to do it. And I think, again, it's part of the issue. If you're doing it relatively quickly, it can be difficult, and it would require a lot of cost benefit to go to another direction. If the GIC becomes more of a viable solution, I don't think that will stop us from leaving. To your question on the fund balance, they used fund balance in FY22. We ended up at about a 4% net increase in premiums across all those plans. They use fund balance to accomplish that. It would have been higher otherwise. That fund balance, to your point, do we need to walk away from if we leave West Suburban? Yes, potentially. But at the same point, that balance, is helping us right now as it relates to FY22's budget.
Thank you.
Okay. So if we're done with the health insurance stuff, then I'll get to what I was doing too. So I'm going to share the workbook, and I'll before we start diving in, I'll give the overview of where everything is here. Okay. And just, let's see, since I can't see what you guys see, I'll just put it up here. Okay. So let me explain a few things here. Okay? First of all, what we traditionally do when we do our recommended budget is we move right across the spreadsheet, right? We have our guideline model. We go to our requested column, which is what all of the departments request. We then come up with our recommended budget based on those requests and where we think the numbers are. Okay. What I've done with this is, as you recall, when we started and asked for the requests, we did not have any COLA built in. When I mentioned last week that I had asked Travis to put 2% in, just to be clear, I wasn't saying anybody, we haven't voted on it, it hasn't been signed up to it any way, shape, or form. What I was looking at was to try to get a somewhat realistic picture. If we know there's going to be some COLA and we don't know what it is, at least we have some number in there just for calculation purposes, right? And that's why I pulled the 2% or asked Travis to prepare 2%, okay? What I then did is I filled in the recommended column because really I needed another column and I didn't feel like messing up with the spreadsheet. I filled in the recommended column with the requested numbers adjusted for the 2%. So I'm not in any way, shape, or form suggesting that the recommended column is our actual recommendation at this point. This is just for discussion. And then what I did with that recommended column was I looked at what Travis had suggested for certain areas. Obviously, we've had some discussions about some certain areas where we differ on our modeling with Travis. And that's the discussion we can have is about that. But just to understand, all the recommended budgets right now are not our actual recommendations, not in any way being endorsed as recommendations. That's just the adjusted request numbers with the COLA adjustment in them, okay? And as you can see, there are a couple that aren't adjusted at all because like the schools, as they said to us last week, leave the number at 37,098,523, things like that. The other thing I wanted to point out is on the revenue side, Travis sent out to the committee the revenue model and the revenue and expense model that he had. I did what I always used to do with Paul, which is I matched up his data to mine to make sure we're all on the same page, okay? Now, the numbers that I have entered in the recommended column there match up with Travis's sheet that he sent us. And as you see, if you look at Travis's sheet, he shows a surplus of $98,000, okay? So this recommended column effectively reflects what Travis sent us, okay? Now, the requested column reflects the actual requests we receive as well as the model differences. Now, I don't expect that tonight we're going to vote on recommendations. I think we have to have the conversation about some of these numbers, right? For one, we do have, just to point out a couple of things for starting points, right? The 238,500 that Travis has here, that's based on what he actually knows to be in the warrant right now, right? The warrant's not final yet. So the fact that we had 270, that was a model number. We were close, off by a little bit. We can obviously discuss that, once the warrant's finalized. I don't think anybody would have an issue with aligning to the correct number for the warrant, okay? The other thing is, if you look down here, it's snow and ice, right? We build in the $60,000, which is the typical amount of the deficits. Typically, we budget 250, and it comes out to be between 300, 325 in a typical winter. Obviously, this winter was a little higher, but that's okay. But for modeling and for budgeting purposes, Travis does not build this in, okay? The other thing is on the revenue side, he's using the FY21 cherry sheet numbers, right? And again, this is just prerogative. This is not one right versus one wrong. It's just to understand the differences, right? So the numbers he has for state aid and the offsets and charges, you'll see they match our original model because that's what we built the model off of, right? Except for the state aid, because this was built off of expecting a cut in state aid of a few, 7% or so. But then we revised that to the governor's budget later. So in any case, so understand there are revenue discrepancies there. And then of course, the most significant difference between what Travis has modeled and what we have modeled is the capital set aside, right? We had, as you recall, we had been building that up over the years for what, about 14, 15 years now. Prior to the pandemic, if we had not had the pandemic, we would have been looking at putting $2 million in for FY21, right? in order to maintain budget stability, and by budget stability, what I mean is not having to fire people, basically, you're not having to lay people off or anything like that. When we had to rejigger things at the beginning of the pandemic, we brought that number down to 1.415, I believe. I could go look it up, but it was just over 1.4 million, with the understanding that our goal is to get back on plan, okay? Plan being 2 million, right? So when we start our modeling this year and we start our planning, we put the 2 million in there to basically go back to where we should have been in FY21. Travis obviously differs and he's using a lower number here. And that's, if you look at the delta in the bottom line from what we have, remember our requested column here does not include the COLA part, which is what Travis, you said that's another like 80, 90K, something like that?
Non-union at 2% is about 90, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so 90K. So our bottom line number here is really, if you were to make apples to apples with the COLA part, would be 90K worse than what you're seeing, okay? However, the one thing I will say is that we also, on our side, we looked at and took the governor's numbers for the offsets charges and the local aid. So we have a benefit there that is not in Travis's number by about 120, 140, whatever that delta, that small local aid delta was between FY21 and the governor's budget. So those are the parameters, right? So we've got 60K additional here. We've got the governor's numbers, not the FY21 numbers. We've got the 2 million here. And budget-wise, we don't have the 2% in the requested column, and his numbers do. So anyway, that's the starting point. So I think that when we're talking about where we go from here, one of the discussions we're going to have is, and obviously Travis is part of these discussions as well, is can we get to alignment on some of these numbers to get to what we all believe is the right bottom line. Okay, so I'll open the floor up to whoever wants to make some comments. So Dan, go ahead. Oh, I'm not hearing you for some reason.
Sorry, I think you made a really good point there, that this is a collaborative process. This is not the Finance Committee just standing up on high and declaring it shall be so. I think that, we certainly want to work with Travis and try to reach an understanding and an agreement with him, even if at the end of the day, it's our recommendation. One of the things that came up last night at the select board meeting was that apparently there was no view that last week when we were discussing sort of asking people to prioritize, all departments to sort of prioritize their requests, and the select board, only because they have so many different budgets and so many different requests from each of those budgets, kind of our natural sort of place to sort of start looking. There was a view that there wasn't actually a consensus by the Finance Committee that we make the request that they start at least thinking about whether it's prioritization or whether it's if we sort of come down to some number where we say we want to put more money aside in capital, and that because we're trying to get back there and we're trying to sort of balance and balance sort of current spending versus known sort of future needs, that maybe there won't be enough money at the end of the day to fund every single request that there is. And then there are also some things from other departments that I'm not sure I totally think that we need. I think there's certainly money in the assessor's budget that may be able to come out and things like that. But I wanted to sort of find out from the committee, because just so that maybe we can even take a vote on it, or just show that there is consensus that we do want budget requesters to sort of be looking at the budgets and making sure that we know what their priorities are, or at least they're willing to sort of start thinking about that, so that if we do come to them and say, you're going to have to shave something back here or there, that they're thinking about that.
Okay. Well, well, what is, again, I throw it open to discussion with the committee. The other thing I wanted to point out that you reminded me of when you said that, Dan, was, and this is more for people who may be watching at home, right? This is in essence the maximum budget, right? The the assumed levy in here is the maximum we can tax, right? So just to be clear, I mean, the reason I want to say that is because Prop 2.5 gives us a limit, and to the extent that we run the budget to exactly zero or close to zero, that in essence is saying we're going to raise the levy as much as we can in the next year. And I think that's important to understand too. And I know that Travis, agrees with us on that regard. Go ahead, Travis.
Oh, I do agree with that, right? I think, from a modeling standpoint, one of the things is that anything on the bottom line, is certainly should not be considered to be quote unquote available and those types of things. At the end of the day, unused levy capacity has a value to the town from a financial standpoint of being, sort of prepared, and, has a value to the taxpayer in terms of those are dollars that aren't being sort of put into tax bills. So I think that's an important point. I think the one point that I would make that I think, sort of wasn't brought up in that description and Dan's explanation as well of last night is that, I don't think there's any sort of concern in saying, understanding that there are things within the 22 requests under select board budgets or non-select board sort of controlled budgets that are, if tweaks need to be made, that, some things are more important than others and can be ranked accordingly. I think the concern is that, I think just as any new request needs to be justified in the FY22 budget, additionally, I don't personally find the fact that, there was a desire to get to a $2 million number on the capital expenditure, amount going into that fund to be quite compelling. I mean, quite honestly, and I think we got into a little bit last night, and I would reiterate the points that I made. I don't view a number going into the capital expenditure fund as an amount that needs to be hit in a dollar figure, right? I think the most important things that we look at as it relates to the capital expenditure fund, the general stabilization fund, and other reserves is what net impact we're looking at. So when I look at, $1.85 million as a total tax supported article, I understand I'm looking at it a little differently than you are. At the end of the day, though, if you back out from that amount, the three articles that I currently am assuming from raise and appropriate, which are the DPW feasibility study, which we can have, has its own merits to discuss. The 9 Green Street demolition has its own merits to discuss at $118,500. And the Blair Square Committee has its own merits to discuss for construction documents that would lead to a project potentially in the fall through the CPC. If you remove those, you come to about over $1.6 million that would be available if that's a decision to go into the CapEx fund at May town meeting, with a capital expenditure list that, again, still needs to be vetted and sort of recommended approval or not approval, and needs to be, sort of approved by the select board to even put on the warrant at under $600,000 that would be coming out of the CapEx fund for a net increase of the CapEx fund of $1 million in May, of a balance that, I can pull up here as well, puts it certainly we're within all of the financial guidelines that we have as a town. So one of the things I want to discuss with the capital subcommittee and this group as a whole is the long-term planning of the capital expenditure fund. But at the end of the day, where I am, as I look at sort of, and historically, it is the net impact of the CapEx fund that I'm primarily concerned with, and not necessarily a $2 million number that I think needs to be justified, just as all of the requests that you're asking for justification on the budget side, as you should be. I think, there needs to be justification in the number as well, and working towards $2 million, quite frankly, doesn't move me personally.
So just for my own, for Travis, the one question I would have is, what, based on what you see right now, obviously this hasn't been discussed by the capital subcommittee and so forth yet, but request-wise, what do you see for May and what do you see for October right now for capital?
I'd be happy to pull that up. I know I sent it to the full group, and I know Dan referenced it last night, because I wanted to make sure, as we approach May, people understand in the grander context that May is not the only time that we request capital. Generally, it's split pretty evenly between May and October. The difference being that, we know the free cash number going into October, and the point that was made last night is that we don't want to rely on the free cash number. But, historically what has happened in the last 3 to 5 years has been that raise and appropriate has gone into CapEx in May, was offsetting at or above what has come out of the CapEx. And then in the fall, free cash has gone into CapEx at or above what's come out of the CapEx fund. And so it has continued to grow, which is, again, not a criticism, a good thing. And I think we need to sort of make sure we see how that's going to work. But the list that I sent out, and I can pull it up if you'd like, is what I'm aware of for requests in May, that may get changed slightly. And then what I tried to put in for context is things that I think realistically may come up for October, including things that I'm still looking for clarity on whether or not, on the larger items that the school may actually be interested in, but I don't want to remove until I know that they're not, because I want that context in there. And I want to give sort of the most quote unquote conservative look at what we may be needing out of the capital fund. So I can pull that up if you'd like, but as it relates to specifically May, just under 600,000 is assumed for projects to at least be requested. And then in my model that we were discussing 1.6 going in for a net impact of an increase of $1 million into that fund.
Okay, so I'll go look out. They have questions, so I'll go do some digging here while we're, hold on. Oh, I can't go to my participants list. So now I can't see what the order was. I think Vin was first, but Dan, you've spoken a lot, so let's Vin go first. Go ahead, Vin.
Dan's already spoken. Yeah, I guess the question, what? Okay. The question I have, because I'm looking at what you sent us with the SIP construction report, construction in progress document you sent dated March 12th, and you have a total CapEx of $2.4 million. How does that reconcile to the 1.6, I guess? If that's what you're trying to do right now, I'm not sure. I'm just trying to get to the number and understanding 2 is just a holding number, not necessarily what we want to do. And so.
Okay, so I just want to make sure, actually, if the chair could pull this model down, I can put up what I'm talking about.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I can stop sharing. Go ahead.
All right, let me pull up. I think this is what Vin just referenced. I know it was what Dan was referencing last night. So this is just the 1 year, right? And so, included in what Vin is referring to, I sent out that I believe everybody should have access to, is beginning to move towards a 5-year outlook, right? And I want that for context as well. But this is a 1 year, this is the list that I'm looking at for May. Again, tweaks coming. But if you look at it for May, this is a total of $850. I don't have anything for the water enterprise fund, although that's a separate funding source. Going down, the CapEx, this is what I'm talking about coming out of that fund. The raise and appropriate is the articles I mentioned earlier, the Blair Square, 9 Green Street, and DPW feasibility, with other being the conversation we had earlier on a balance that would cover this request if it's going to stay on the warrant. So then everything else on here essentially rolls up 4 items for for police department, 2 items under facilities, 2 items under DPW, and then these are the school items that I believe they previously voted. I know that I pulled it off of a previous presentation of theirs. And then the point that I made earlier is that I have these 2. I think, quite frankly, it was the finance committee that had a very much, we expect there not to be any Chromebooks on this list come the fall conversation. And as I said to the school committee, I believe in a conversation that the liaisons were in, I'll remove this the second they tell me to remove it, but I'm not going to remove it and then have it pop back up.
Well, just for the record, we've been saying that for many years and they're still on. So
it never works.
So that's the way that this looks. And so to your point, Vin, of all these requests, for example, of the capital requests, 1.46 would be in this assumption coming out of water and not hitting CapEx at all. That is not currently. I'm putting this on here again for the quote unquote conservative look to make sure we see a big picture. At this moment, I don't know that a water main project, again, a different funding source, will be on the October warrant. I'm placing it here because it may be the hope that we do that. Separately aside entirely is that ARPA very heavily has language that, please do water infrastructure with this money. I don't know if that's going to be a fit or not. We'll see. But so at the moment, again, everything that I have on the capital list for May specific to come out of the CapEx fund is just under $600,000. The raise and appropriate are the three that I mentioned earlier. The other comes to what I have. Adding in, the cruisers in October that we know always sort of end up on the list may look slightly different. A couple of the items that I know are coming on the public safety side, again, if we assume that there is no free cash that will be going into CapEx in the fall, you're absolutely right that at the moment, I may be assuming more capital within FY22 than you're right, we're raising the value of in the CapEx fund. At the same point, and let me just, I'll pull up essentially another sheet here. I paused my sharing. So this is, can you see this list? This is the policies, right? So this is another list that, again, I'm not saying that we're overfunded in CapEx. In fact, what I'm saying is what I'd like to discuss with the capital subcommittee is making sure that we're using the CapEx fund and we are adjusting the language to meet our reality and help us, this as a town, use it the best possible way, which may be to allow the CapEx fund to interface with our debt load, but that's a future conversation. Either way, where we are as a balance at over $7 million in CapEx and over $7 million in stabilization fund is very much in line with the policies, right? And so, again, I'm not arguing that we don't need to be doing a substantial amount in capital. I'm just arguing that I'm not seeing the justification beyond wanting to hit a number of 2 million. That again, I'm looking at it as just in a different way. That is to say, we're going to increase the value of the CapEx fund because we understand the need for that. We're keeping that capacity within the budget. I just, again, I'm comfortable with my model, and I understand that does not match yours, but that's just a flip side argument of a similar conversation, I guess.
Well, I guess, and I'll get to you in a second, Dan. And Ben, you have the floor. So
well, I'm still confused at where's the 1.6 number you're coming up with? Because I see between the 858 plus the 1.653. Are you thinking budgeting the whole amount here, but then we have a delta though? Because your numbers are at 1.6 versus.
Well, what you need to look at, Vin, is scroll down a little more, Travis. Yeah, look at the two numbers for CapEx, right? That's the $2 million in the two town meetings right there. So that takes out all the things that are funded from other sources.
So it's still $2 million versus 1.6. I guess that's my question is, well, why are you less than that? Are you assuming that we're going to be pulling money out of the CapEx fund or are you going to use free cash or what's?
So again, historically in May, the amount of money that's come out of CapEx has been at least offset in the past multiple years, offset by the amount going in from raise and appropriate.
Yep.
And in the fall, the amount going into CapEx from free cash has offset or been greater than the amount coming out of CapEx in the October timeframe.
Yep.
So in each cycle, the balance of CapEx increases while we continue to do capital, the pay-as-you-go capital, essentially.
Yep.
And I would have the same assumption based on the Q3 report that you got from Sharon earlier, that we will be able to continue that trend in the fall.
So the question, your concern right now is we might be overfunding the CapEx fund.
That's not my concern. My concern is to increase the number that I have in my model. I don't know is necessary. I would love to do it if possible. I'm just saying to have that as the reason that, a request such as, the assistant town administrator / HR change, right? For example,
yep.
I'm not seeing that the call to get to $2 million going into the fund outweighs those issues. And I don't, I guess that would be my easiest way to state it.
Okay.
All set, Ben?
Yep.
Okay, good, Dan?
Yeah, so look, Travis, I totally get what you're saying and understand that. I think that we're looking at it a little differently. I certainly don't think that, that this is necessarily more important than the assistant town administrator HR role that you're trying to. I think that is personally, I think that's an important thing. It's not mine to prioritize, but again, I do think that that's an important initiative and something that will definitely help the town tremendously. My concern, though, is that you are showing $2 million of capital spending potential for this year. I know that there are two big items that are not necessarily locked in stone. And as much as Chromebooks kill me, I've also over the past year, and I'm sure Anne Louise is going to laugh her tail off at this one, but I have come to appreciate the Chromebooks more and also appreciate the damage that are inflicted upon them and see why we're constantly being requested replacements for them. And if anything, I think with all the bringing back and forth this year, which has not been the case necessarily in prior years, at least as much, there very well could be. Anyway, my point is with $2 million there, and we also know that over the summer that the capital request, despite the good work of the capital subcommittee and our anticipation and trying to anticipate these needs and do things on a schedule, we're definitely not there yet. So we also know that list is likely to grow, at least in the number of requests. We may take things off, but there will be more requests coming in. Things break, things, spring leaks, everything, that we know that as time goes on, there are more requests as different departments look at things differently. So we know things are going or we know things are likely to increase there. That it just, and the fact that we were at 2 million prior to the pandemic, we want to get back there. And as I've talked about before, I look at this as much, not just current year spending, but also sort of trying to get there to a point where we can have built into our budget the ability to eventually do a large project. I know your board, the select board, has a number of large projects that they would like to do. And what I would very much like to do is be to at least have the option of doing that under the levy. Maybe we still go for a debt-supported override to see if the town really wants it, and then decide whether we want to support it, fund it under the levy or not. I don't know, but I would really like to try to sort of keep debt exclusion overrides to as minimal a level as possible. Because again, we do know that there's some really large, spending potentials coming forward, and I would hate to sort of use our powder now for that. So, my thing is more about as much about long-term, financial prudence, I guess you would say, versus short-term, spending priorities. And I know it was certainly not appreciated by the chair of the select board last night, my analogy, but again, I kind of view this as, do we spend every last dollar, spend to the levy limit and reduce sort of our sort of building in reserves and capacity in capital. So, again, can we fund that? Do we do that extra trip to Disney this year, or do we try to put that money aside to save for our kids' college so that in the future, when our kids go to college, we have money set aside and we also have rooms, built into the budget for that. So I it's a give and take. And I'm not necessarily saying that the assistant town administrator or anything really, but I would just kind of like to know what the priorities are. Personally, I mean, I'd like to see more information about the changes that are being suggested in the fire department, in the ambulance budget, to see if that is something that's going to fix the problem that we have, because we did put more money into it and it still seems like that's the problem. So maybe before we just sort of put even more money into it, we take some time to really analyze it and see what actually the go forward structure should be. One thing I was talking to somebody about today would be, we're doing a lot of good work on our capital plan, but maybe we really also need an operating plan too going forward, and how we want each department to be structured. And now that we have you here and you've got that a really good sense and drive and committed to doing it, that it could be something that might be helpful there. So what I'm trying to get at is I would love to get the $2 million in the capital set aside, because I think it helps a lot with the sort of the goals of, I actually think it helps a lot with the goals of the select board, honestly, long term, as well as our own sort of financial discipline. But I'm not saying that it's 2 million or bust, right? I mean, I just want to kind of know where different groups stand with their numbers, so that maybe it's not 2 million. Maybe we have to come off of that a little bit, because we're going to be realistic, because we don't want to lose the assistant town administrator position and things like that, right? But I kind of want to know where things lie, so that as we try to make recommendations to town meeting, we can make those recommendations understanding the sort of what we're trading off in between. And right now it's just sort of, because there was no interest by the select board last night in giving us any sort of guidance on what they want. We ask this in the schools every year. We're continuing to ask it and work with them. And I'm not suggesting that the select board budgets will be the ones to bear all that burden if we have to make sort of reduction requests. But anyway, so that I think, I don't know if that's clear or not, but
no, I would say there's a few things there. So again, for things like fire, I think one of the things that I'm sort of stalled out a little bit on how this process goes here is, I have a couple things that don't fall into the select board that I'd like to sort of see cleared up. It seems like that happens sort of towards the end here of this process. But for example, the Board of Health, I think we came to a sort of understanding and I think a good place with the clerk's request because, again, it worked with another request. I think one of the things when I see their request is that I think it really more makes sense outside of the COVID impact. If you sort of look at it holistically as a land use department downstairs, maybe you have a solution. But the solution then in that case does not require a significant increase in the budget, because if that person were helping the building department that has a revolving fund, those dollars don't hit the budget. And if the person who's already benefited there is just going to be working more hours during COVID, well, we have the CARES Act and we have ARPA coming, and that's not, again, something that necessarily needs to fit in the 22 budget. So I guess as I'm sitting here and saying, I understand your point, that you're right. It would be nice to sort of say what gives and what takes here. I don't know where we stand with the fire conversation from the FinCom, right? And so I understand your point. You'd like more information. As I sit here, I know what the select board wants. I understand the request from the fire chief, and I see it as a step towards a long-term plan on the sort of the impact that has been requested is to make sure that we cut down on call times on the EMS side, specifically the solutions that he's come up with as putting us in that direction is the shift diff and the sort of increased training. Well, again, that doesn't get us to the end goal. It gets us in a direction where we're saying to completely revamp the ambulance in FY22 is not possible within the budget. Here is something that puts us in that direction. And by the way, we'd also like to bring in a group like MRI who gives an organizational outlook to say, is this the right model for Holliston now as it was 20 years ago? So all of those things are questions that are ongoing, but at the same point, when the question is, right, how do we rank the need of the 26 police officer versus the increased shift diff in EMS or ambulance, excuse me. Well, I don't necessarily have clarity on where the conversation is going to end up with the Board of Health request or, the recreation request, for example. I get what you're saying, and I think I'm looking at it slightly differently, but I think I'm in the same place as you. And all of that is to say some of those things I think need to be adjusted and can be adjusted. I could do right now if we want to have that conversation. But at the same point, I'm not sure where I'm sitting. Any of those need to be done simply because of the $2 million, which I think, again, we just sort of we're in the general same place there as well.
First of all, let me just say this. While you do not have the sort of the oversight of the Board of Health budget, right? I mean, that's, an independent board. I as the chief personnel officer of the town, I certainly want to know what your opinion is about these things and your recommendation. So, I mean, I very much am interested in hearing your views on that. I personally think that there's $30,000 in the assessor's budget that can come out. The added hours that they want or the contract work that they want. I saw the numbers that they sent. I'm not sold on that. And then we have the stipend. So, I mean, there's definitely places outside of the select board sort of immediate purview that we have to cover. So, but what's frustrating me is that it doesn't seem that the select board even wants to, at least the select board, not you, but the select board wants to sort of have those conversations, or even because they say, oh, well, there's a surplus in the bottom line. So, that to me is like, well, okay, well, now what do I do? Because we're not getting any information from them about it. So, that I guess is where we stick. But I understand. So let's have the conversations about the other things. Can you come up with your thoughts for next week on budgets that aren't necessarily under the select board, but are certainly almost all of these are personnel issues. And so that certainly falls under your purview as the town administrator and the chief, personnel officer of the town. So.
Yeah, and so for the Board of Health, for example, right, I spoke with their chair, I spoke with the agent, I spoke with their staff and others downstairs. And, I think we can go in a direction that sort of accomplishes, generally speaking, what they're looking for without I think it was 25% increase in that particular budget, right? It may end up being result in a conversation on another position that becomes benefited. It would, by redesigning a position, it would need to be posted externally. Those types of conversations are all sort of, again, under, right, to your point, the administrative role there. But I think, we could certainly, I'd like to see that conversation wrapped up. I think they need that certainty going into July. So for those conversations. And then again, I mean, the rec, I think I mentioned previously when Mark Frank presented his budget on the 97 that he put in, hoping to begin to build in grounds and things into his budget, the tax supported budget. I fully support that. I sat down with him and I agree that that's where we need to go in the long run. And since that time, ARPA's changed that and essentially given us most likely the ability to look at any individual groups that have lost revenue as they're obviously a group that is almost entirely supported by their own revenue, and sort of fix an issue that was created by COVID and may not require that $9,700 be put into the tax supported budget. Doesn't mean I don't support grounds and maintenance of parks areas being put into the budget, but it just may be that in FY22 we don't need to do that. So again, I mean,
can I ask you something? A request, if you will. I will continue having this conversation today, but perhaps next week, can you come back with your thinking on where you'd like some of the budgets outside of the select board purview, but certainly under your purview as chief administrator officer, where you think maybe they should be? And I'm not, obviously that I'm not saying that we're going to abrogate our responsibility to you, but because you are trying to put together, we're trying to all look at the whole overall budget. It's also not fair to handcuff you and say you can't change any of those numbers and you just have to sort of take the hit too, right? I mean, so trying to look at everything. And of course, there's still the 800-pound gorilla in that we don't actually have a final school budget number. So, that could easily shift things by different magnitudes one way or the other. So anyway, I know Mark wants to talk, but would that be something you think that would be appropriate for you to look at?
Yeah, I can bring back where I am with that. And again, I mean, I'm not looking just at non-select board budgets, right? That's not my point. My point is,
No, I know you're not. I'm just saying.
Just to look holistically, and there are, right? I mean, I think we can talk where we are with police is entirely, which is impacted obviously by collective bargaining and whether or not the 26th officer makes sense in that sort of realm, right? And all of those conversations, I think your point is, I understand from where you're sitting that it sounds like the select board's not willing to have those conversations. I think at some point it's difficult to just have this conversation when the picture's this big, right? I think that's probably more what it is, but I understand what you're asking for, and I think we can certainly try to wrap that up.
I totally understand that, but just to be clear, it's not that it just sounds like the select board is not willing to have the conversation. Two of them were very clear last night that they were not willing to have that conversation because they saw a surplus in the bottom line, which is one way of looking at the budget. And that to me is not the prudent way of spending taxpayer dollars. So I think we all need to have these conversations. It doesn't even mean that it's going to necessarily lead to any changes. It just means let's just have these conversations. I mean, that's our financial oversight and diligent role. So, you're not shutting it down. I'm just saying that. So.
Okay. Mr. Whitaker.
Perhaps somebody can explain to me where this $2 million came from. It seems like a purely arbitrary number, and I'm sure there's more to it than pure arbitrary. But it does.
I can certainly give you the background there. Okay. When I first got on the finance committee, we were putting away exactly zero into the capital expenditure fund. We were actually not spending any money. Now, in the town's defense, at the time it was there were cuts in local aid and other reasons why that was happening. But capital was not being funded at all. And my first vice chair, Gordon Johnson, will rest in peace, was a very smart financial guy. And he kind of correctly, when he got on the committee, said, this is not a sustainable thing. Obviously, and again, I don't need to explain to everybody on this call, you may get away with 1 year of not taking care of a building or 2 years of not taking care of a building, but eventually the building falls down or the building needs a roof or whatever. So we had a discussion as a committee many, many years ago, I think it was going back to like FY 08 or 09, we started this, okay, where we talked about it. We funded some capital initially out of we funded the capital needs kind of on an as request basis. And then we had the conversation of, we know our capital needs are running higher than what we're appropriating on an annual basis. We need to get to a point where the budget contains in it a run rate to go into the capital expenditure fund that covers two things, okay? The current year capital needs, but also provides for a means by which we can help finance debt within the budget. Meaning that you have some component of the allocation you put in every year that's going to go to cover smaller capital items that are just one-time things. And then you can have other things like, we've seen some of these studies, right, where there may be a long-term cost and you could potentially fund part or all of that within the levy limit by saying, okay, we're going to have some steady debt burden for some of the larger capital projects. But that debt burden payment will be funded by this annual allocation. So of that annual allocation, you'd have part going to current capital, part going to debt funding, right? When we did the initial analysis all those years ago, it was apparent that the number needed to be big, just big, okay? And the rough calculations showed it to be somewhere between 2 and 3 million. If you started to factor in all the capital of the town that might fall under this. I mean, remember, we have things like $875,000 fire trucks. That's the most expensive, to be clear, just so that everybody doesn't think every fire truck costs that much. But, there are things like that. And there are things like committee and field. There are other large capital things that are not just buildings, right? So in any case, at that time, the conversation was, let's start working towards a number that, and the hope was, as we build up the number, we knew from the start the number had to be 2 million or more, right? And this was more than 10 years ago. So on an annual basis, we kind of sat there and said, let's just work towards that. And hopefully along the way, we get to a point where we can get a true, Paul did a lot of work on a capital plan, but part of and I'm not trying to criticize Paul, he did a good job, but part of what happened with that plan was it was really, at some level, Paul did some massaging, but at some level it was really a compilation of what every department said it needed, right? And so Paul was doing his job of kind of looking at that and trying to figure out, but that was the plan we used that said, hey, we need a lot more money than we were putting aside. So then as we started building it up over the years, right, it started at 350,000 and then we started putting more and more as we could. When we got to about $1.5 million, $1.25 million, something like that, that's when we had the Collins Center come in. Collins Center did their analysis. I don't know if you've seen that because you're relatively new, but the Collins Center did this whole capital analysis, and they showed that we were going to need $2 to $3 million a year, and they had a combination of debt funding and the whole bit, just like we had modeled, but they showed the number as being pretty high. Okay, so the plan was we get it to around 2 million, and hopefully by the time we get to 2 million, we stop there and then reassess where we are and say, okay, how much more do we need? And fortunately for us, to be honest, right, I'm glad Travis is here because Travis is going to be basically, that falls under his purview. We now have a TA that can really work on that, and that's what he's doing. So to Travis's credit, that's what he's doing. So the number is not arbitrary in the sense that we didn't sit there and say, let's just pick $2 million. We said all the data we were seeing along the way was it's got to be north of 2 million, but we know we have to get to 2 million first before we go north of 2 million. By the time we get to 2 million, let's hopefully have better plans. Now, if you look at what our capital spending has done, right, we also knew there was neglected stuff, right, because we hadn't been spending as much as we should. Even when we started putting away the 350, that's not enough, right? When was the last time we saw 350 as the only capital request we had, right? So we moved forward and our capital spending has increased, the run rate has increased to basically match what we're putting away. And even with, as you saw, even with Travis's spreadsheet that he shared earlier, right? He's looking, again, it's not final. I don't want to throw Travis under the bus. None of that is final yet. But his model just right now is $2 million, right? And if you look at what we spent last year, it was 2.3 million. We look at what we spent the year before that was 2.75 million, right? So this idea that we have a run rate that's above 2 million is borne out by the recent data, okay? So what I would hope, right? What I would hope, and this is just my opinion, right? Because we've got 7 members, is that we could stay to the 2 million this year and then give Travis a year to basically say, what does the number really need to be? He's working on a 5-year plan. He's working on, he's got all the data from Collins. I don't expect, he hasn't even been here a year yet, right? But give him that year to say, okay, between now and FY23 budget, let's try to work that out and say, what is the number we need? And if he comes back and says, hey, I've looked at it and here's the whole capital plan and we only need 1.9, then that's great for us, okay? Now, that's why I said the 2 million number is not arbitrary, okay? Now, moving on from there, the other thing I would comment on is Travis is completely correct in saying that we have grown the capital expenditure fund a fair amount over the last few years, in spite of spending 2 million, because we've had favorable free cash. Okay? My personal concern with, and why I kind of favor a higher number than the 1.6 million is I'm convinced we need more than that, right, as a run rate to begin with. But the other part of it is, again, going back to the history, when we started this whole discussion, there were several things on the FinCom's radar years ago, okay? There was no set aside for OPEB, the capital was not being taken care of, right? And our pension obligation, our stabilization fund was below where it should have been, and our pension, through Middlesex is underfunded, right? And that's not us, that's Middlesex, right? We made a conscious decision back then to tackle those one by one, right? So we tackled OPEB from the savings we got from the first healthcare reform bill, right? That's where the 1.5 went. That, again, was not arbitrary. That was the amount of savings. That's what the schedule said we needed to put aside. We tackled the stabilization fund part by using free cash and other available monies to bolster stabilization, to the point where now it's at target, and really we just need to maintain it by putting little bits in every year to match it with the budget growth, right? We raised the capital, as we're talking about now, right? We're getting close to the 2 million on capital, and we've used the free cash for those last two purposes, to get stabilization to solve problem number 2, and to bolster capital, which is problem number 3, partly because we see that there are other things. And just to give you an example, we're going to see on the warrant a study for a DPW building, right? That may be another $15 million project. That could be funded completely outside, with a debt exclusion, but maybe that's something that at 15 million we could fund within the budget and not have people pay more taxes for it, right? But the other nut that's been ignored in all this is the pension, right? As you know, we had the conversation last year and last fall when we were talking about the December town meeting about the pension stabilization fund. So one of my concerns, just as, again, my opinion, you're all entitled to your own opinion, is I would like to keep the capital up a little bit, because that idea that we've always exceeded the expense is only true because we've thrown most of the free cash there. But if we're now talking about going to problem number 4, which is our pension, and we're going to set up this pension stabilization fund, my suggestion would be we keep it at 2 million, or ask the town to keep it at 2 million, and then start diverting free cash to the pension, to nut number 4, which is the pension problem, right? And if you start doing that, then you're not going to have this situation where you're always putting more money in October, right? You might get to a point where you're putting much less in, and the rest is going to the pension fund to bolster our funded percentage there. And that's, again, Travis can have his opinions, Dan can have his opinions, but that's the history. I'm just giving you the whole history of how we ended up where we are and why I feel the way I do about this spreadsheet. So, yeah, Michelle.
I just want to tell Mark that I emailed everyone our financial policies. I was going to send it to Mark, but I emailed it to everyone. So if you check your email later, you can take it.
And by the way, that policy document, to be clear, it needs to be revisited, not because it's defective, but because we usually do our revisit of it. I'm trying to think, was it 19? It's due for, I think this summer I think it's due for its biennial, review. So, obviously with Travis on board, he'll be part of that now too. So that's the thing. So go ahead, Mark, what were you going to say?
So I was just curious if there's a reason, and I understand the process, and thank you for that background, but I'm curious if there's a larger reason why that wouldn't be just tied directly to a percentage of whatever the total tax base or the revenues for the year would be.
And that's one option. That is certainly one option, and that's obviously what a discussion we can have, right? The feeling of the committees back then, right, was we know it needs to be at least 2 million. And I'll tell you, when Mr. Connolly was on the select board, he was a very big proponent of saying make it a percentage and make it 3 to 5% of the omnibus or something every year. Where if you look at that number, that's kind of where we are, right?
I was just going to say my idea would be to at least get it to 2.5, so then you can look at maybe $1 million of that going to support the debt, which $1 million in today's interest rates anyway would support over 20 years about $15 million project. And I know that there is at least one of those out there. So that's just kind of the thought process. Again, it's building in and saving and planning for the future, because you have bigger expenses in the future, and trying to do what you can now, but not necessarily blow up your future just because you want to spend now.
Yeah, but Dan, I still want to go get a pizza on Friday night, man. Come on.
Yeah, but just don't go to Disney again.
Okay, so Travis, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, so I think you touched on one aspect too of why the level that is in my recommendation or my model, I suppose, the difference between yours and mine. I see a lot of the similar things that you're referring to, right? And one of the components, I think we've talked about it, but not directly this, which is that the 22 budget represents the first year that there is no debt service within the actual budget. All of that debt service that was non-excluded, that is to say outside of Prop 2.5, has matured in FY21. And so if we are going to want to approach any project, but I'll use the DPW as an example, if we're going to want to approach that without a debt exclusion, because the benefit to that, obviously, to the taxpayer, if it's within Prop 2.5, then the project gets done, and yet it doesn't simply raise your tax bill for the life of that bond. It's within the tax. We have to work out the rest of the budget around that. There's a benefit to the taxpayer to do that. To maintain the level that I have in here is partially based on that. Maintaining the capacity within the budget, the tax supported articles comes to that for that reason, in my opinion. It speaks to a lot of the things that you mentioned, and it's also one of the reasons that I mentioned before. And as I said, and I think the way this conversation has gone is that we need to revisit the way the policies look, because I think, quite honestly, if we relook at how we're actually using the capital expenditure fund and free it up to work in a way that would allow us to put debt within the levy. That is to say, we do not get a debt exclusion. We borrow within the levy. But in the beginning of a debt cycle, when your debt is at the highest, before you begin to make the principal payments, the debt declines, we use the capital expenditure fund, which may require some tweaks to the language of the fund. We allow that to be used to offset the peak debt service years, which is generally going to be the first 3 to 5 years. We put that in the schedule. We make it very clear that that's the intention, so that S&P doesn't come and say, oh, you're hitting your budget, you're supporting your budget through the use of the capital expenditure fund. There are ways that the capital expenditure fund that, again, we're very far, in some instances, in a good position with where it is. If we make those tweaks, we can accomplish a number of the things that really we could put ourselves in a position where the only real conversation where we would have for a debt exclusion is going to be a project like a high school that absolutely could never be done, regardless of where this capital expenditure fund was put, would ever be able to be done within the levy. And so I think, again, I don't think I disagree very significantly with any of the way that these conversations are going. I'm disagreeing to a degree of how far it needs to go within this budget, right? And so I just want to make that point is I don't think any of the things you said, and I think for the most part, I share most of the sort of fiscal opinions, right? It just comes down to a degree at the end of the day here. And I don't, again, I'm not personally swayed by the 2 million. That really is all it is. But I understand the thinking behind it.
Right, and the other thing I'll say is that which I probably should have pointed out when we were talking about the spreadsheet, right? And I'll say this before I say anything, which is I'm just going to make this statement and that's it. I don't want to discuss any details for obvious reasons, right? But we have union contracts that are still outstanding, and that because of that, we don't know. We shouldn't look at either column of these spreadsheets as being set in stone in terms of this is our exact bottom line, right? So I just, I think that it all depends on your approach. So Travis, let me ask you a question. Let's say, and this is purely hypothetical, okay? Let's say the schools came back and the schools said, hey, we, found some savings in our budget. We did this, we made these bunch of changes. We're changing our request from $37.1 roughly million to, $36.7 million, right? So they let's say they freed up $400,000 somehow. And again, no idea how they do that, but just for hypothetical sake, would you then turn around and say, we could raise that to $2 million?
I don't know that I would start there, right? I think, as you said, there's a number of items. One is creating the pension stabilization fund that's been long discussed, and the idea here would be to start it in a relatively slow manner, but with a plan in place. So, would it be to just simply increase the capital expenditure? No, not necessarily, but I think that would be part of it. Certainly, it's not uncomfortable for me to go over the 1.85, and then the last conversation that adds the other component is how much this group and others would be interested in that scenario in saying, just as we did last year with 550,000 unused levy capacity at the end of the year, would we in that situation look at this and say, we have a budget that meets all of our needs, and we would want to look at potentially increasing the reserves slightly, but we'd also want to make sure that that's a component as well. So I can't answer it specifically. I think the way that you're mentioning it, but would I be comfortable increasing the number into reserves if that was how this sort of worked out? Yes. My point is more in the long run of let's prioritize X, Y, and Z. I'm just saying that I'm not necessarily I'm not agreeing with the guys that gets you to that position. That's all.
Okay, well, the reason I'm saying that is because I just the way I've interpreted your comments is that you said, hey, relative to other things that we want to spend money on, I'm willing to take capital down to do that, right? Which okay, that's fine, right? That's what I'm saying is if it took less money to do those, to still get those things, right? And that's why I picked the schools as an example, right? Because who knows how they get there. But let's say they said, hey, we discovered savings, we're getting extra money from the Fed to cover one-time expenses or whatever, who the hell knows, Chapter 70, some mechanism to get it. Then what I'm saying to you is if you had the ability to fund everything you wanted to fund in the budget right now, but that there was greater excess, as I said, there's always the discussion of, okay, where does it go? But I'm just saying that to me, if the 1.6, I mean, you can look at your number and you can see that in a sense is, I'm not saying it's kind of fitting in with what you want to do, right? And what I'm saying is to the extent that other budgets adjust to a level where that number can go up. And again, let's say it could go up above 2 million. I don't think anybody in the committee is saying, hey, we just put it all in capital. But I'm saying if we had an extra 450,000 somehow, and we only needed 300 something to get to 2 million, we said, okay, we raise that to 2 million and then take the other one and, do whatever, put that in pension stabilization or whatever. I just want to know if that was something that you would be on board with as a means to, get to a unified point between where we are and where you are.
Yeah, I think if again, all of the things that I highlighted earlier that I think still can come down, if the decision is rather than leaving it as excess levy capacity, everybody is in agreement that it's more prudent to put it into reserves, I think that's fine. What I'm saying is, and again, I think what your point is that I somehow backed into the 1.6 to make sure everything else fits, and that's not the case. What I'm saying is that the overall picture of tax-supported articles, including the 3 that are raise and appropriate, plus the money that would presumably go into CapEx, that's the 1.85 that I think is important from a planning perspective in the long run to make sure that we maintain that capacity, because we're going to need to build budget back. We're going to need to build debt back into the budget, and a number of other reasons that we've highlighted here tonight. And so, the 1.6 going into CapEx with 600,000 being spent for a net increase of $1 million is not. It fits quite well in line, and it is really the big picture that I'm looking at. But if that number increased because we come to an agreement that gets the Board of Health what they're looking for, but decreases their budget, and the idea is let's put that sort of difference into CapEx rather than let it sit on the bottom line, because we think that's prudent. Yes, I would be in support of that if that's sort of what everybody is looking for.
Yeah, but see, I think we look at things a little differently, because I don't look at that $1 million as going into the CapEx fund. I look at that $1 million as just simply money that we're going to spend in the fall, and in fact, we're going to spend more than that, right? I mean, we have $2 million in capital already, sort of, potentially identified, and yeah, the things could change around a little bit, but what we're essentially saying, if we're at your 1.6, is that we're building into our budget a reliance of 400,000. On free cash, I mean, in some ways, or use of the capital reserves, and that to me also kind of is a little bit.
Well, we do have a policy. It says
I don't want to say concerning, but yeah, we have a policy, and it's what the state says is best practices for budgeting, that we don't rely on free cash for spending that we know or anticipate we're going to need to do in a year, whether it's capital spending, but because it's the operating set aside for the capital spending, right? It may be capital spending, but it's that annual appropriation to be able to spend on capital each year. So the items each year aren't recurring, but the dollar amount spent is recurring. So by building in the sort of the reliance on free cash, and as I said last night, one of the things is by not relying on free cash and building that in. A couple of years ago, we were able to pay for those traffic lights downtown, even after we'd done a debt exclusion override, and we didn't increase the taxpayers' dollars because we had that, the capital. It didn't necessarily go to capital projects, right? It went to this large, $2 million monstrosity of a calamity that are those 3 traffic lights downtown. But at least we didn't increase the taxpayers' taxes to do it. So I don't look at this as putting $1 million into the CapEx fund, and sort of increasing the balance. I look at it as just how much money we have to spend in October, when we know that there are going to be a lot more requests and probably more coming in, as I said earlier.
Yes, I think we look at it differently. I don't look at it at all in relying on free cash going into the fall. I also don't necessarily look at the decision. I think one of the things that again, part of the conversation on the policy and the planning of the fund is to say, is it catastrophic if in a given year we spend more money on capital out of the fund than we put into the fund, whether it be raise and appropriate or free cash? Right. It seems to me like this group is of the impression that it has to grow on an annual basis.
No, that's not true.
That's not true. We're not trying to grow the capital fund. Do we still have the tower revenue going into the capital fund? I think there's other sources that's earning income. We're not trying to grow the capital fund. I will say that eventually that, as you said, using the capital fund to jumpstart some of those the first years for debt payments absolutely makes sense. And finding projects that make sense to spend a good slug of it is hopefully something that we'll be able to do. So I guess my just because we're kind of talking in circles now, I guess my request would be that the committee sort of give its opinion, whether we do it through a vote or not, that we at least sort of ask the select board to look at its priorities, and whether they want to give it to us or not, they start sort of thinking about what their priorities are. So if we get there, they have at least have had the conversation, or they've chosen not to, and that's their choice. But given that there was confusion last night about whether we actually even wanted them to prioritize or not, I'm not sure how that was possible, but I would like to sort of make something official there. Then I'd like to see what Travis kind of comes back with, and then we can all kind of look through where the budget is and where we can maybe make some savings, because I would like to find a way to get that number up. It may not go to 2. I share the chair's desire to get it to 2, but I'm also realistic that that throwing 400, trying to push that up 400,000, and which would essentially cause nobody to get really anything that they wanted, is also probably not very realistic. But that doesn't mean that there's that we shouldn't try to sort of balance the desire for the near-term spending versus that longer-term sort of goal of getting that fund up so that we can actually do something real with it. So anyway, does other people?
Yeah, and to be clear, I think that a year from now, the discussion will be quite different, right? Because Travis will have had a chance to, go through a lot of this with the capital subcommittee, and to, he's already done a lot of work already, to his credit. And as I said, I think that the original point I made was, right, we know it's a big number. We don't know what it is. And we know it's above 2 million. We suspect it's above 2 million. All the data we've had says it's above 2 million. And so the question is, hopefully we actually, for the first time in a while, will have that number, or have some real solid foundation on which to base that number, and then say, okay, this is the number we want to get to. Because the other thing I wanted to point out for anybody who, the committee, but also anybody who may be listening at home, is, the good thing is, once you get to where you need to be to sustain the spending you have, right, then the adjustments that you need on an annual basis are far less, right? The tough part is getting there, right? Just like we said with stabilization, right? It took many years to get to where we want to go. Once we get to our target, and we, as 10.1% of the omnibus or whatever, right? Then from then on, you're just putting in little maintenance amounts every year to keep it tracking with the omnibus, right? It's the same with the capital, right? We're growing it. So during the growth process, when you get it to where you want it to be, or where you think it needs to be, that takes many years. But if you can get it to where it needs to be, then on an annual basis, you don't need to be throwing a lot of your delta revenue every year at it. You need to be throwing much less. And that's
the 5 years, like the 5 years we worked free cash out of the budget.
Exactly. Right.
So anyway, can I propose? I don't know how we would want to do it. Is anyone opposed to ask?
Well, that's what I was going to say. Let's hear from the rest of the committee. Right. It's been largely limited discussion. So what are the opinions that we have on the rest of the committee? Since everybody's muted, I'm guessing I'm not hearing much from anybody. Anybody have an opinion? We're not going to vote on it tonight, but I'd like to know where everybody stands.
Well, I think that we need to get more numbers and figure out what the schools want before we come back and ask people to prioritize things. Because right now we have abstract numbers without the school, as you put it, the elephant in the room. We're kind of just sitting in the dark.
Well,
but we're running out of time.
But I think ultimately we're going to need the prioritization. So asking people to do that now, I don't think is the wrong answer. And obviously the schools typically come back with that information anyway, or at least we usually ask for it from them, and they do a really nice job with that. So I would echo that. I think it's the right thing to do. And
the select board only has 2 meetings before we have to put this to bed, basically. So I'm just saying,
keep in mind, from a calendar perspective, if the next mediation session is April 28th, technically speaking, we have to go to press on the 30th, right? So we may not have a clarity on a school number until right before then. In fact, when Emily stated that, my first thought was I may post us for something like the 29th or something, just in case we have the opportunity to adjust things before we go to press, right? It wouldn't be a long meeting, but it would just be kind of okay, but anyway, just to put that in context, right? So the original thinking was the schools might have a number on the 14th, which was when they were originally thinking the second mediation session was going to be. That would align to us having a regular meeting, being able to discuss it, maybe meeting over vacation week. Now it's going to be much tighter. So I think the conversation with the schools, and again, this will be something that the liaisons will take up with the budget subcommittee, but I think that's a big, it's a big nut out there that still has to be cracked before we can solve and make sure we have a stable budget. So
And I'm not suggesting we get to that prioritization list. I just want people to be thinking about it because there are limited numbers of meetings in between there, and just having a chance to do it first gives us a flexibility so that we have it if we need it.
Okay. So Tim, Mark, where do you have opinions on this?
Okay. Sorry, go ahead, Tim. You look like you're about to actually talk.
I'm not I would be in favor of requesting a prioritization list. I think if we have that information available to us, then when these numbers firm up, it'll make it a lot easier to have a conversation about how everything falls out.
Okay, Mark?
So I have another newbie stupid question, sorry, but by getting these requests, well, this one might be. By getting these requests, haven't we already received what prioritization would be? Why would they even request it if we're not? I mean, I honestly don't think it would take the additional hours for the person for Travis would hire. Why would he even request that? Why would he talk to us about that if it wasn't a priority?
So, no, I think that just to be clear on what I think Dan's after, and obviously Dan can clarify if I misstate this, right? We get a bunch of requests from, and in the select board's case in particular, and I see Tina's hand up, I'll let her speak in a moment, but in the select board's case in particular, they oversee a large number of departments, right?
Yeah.
In those departments, each of the requests have things that they want, right? So Dan's point is, okay, you've asked for, an extra police officer, you've asked for extra hours, things like this in some departments, so forth and so on. So yes, they've asked for everything they want in that sense, in the sense that the request. What Dan's saying is, okay, if the budgets end up being a little tighter, or we need to make some room or make some adjustments, tell us what you think is most important and least important, so that if we have to make an adjustment, in our recommendations, right? And again, ultimately town meeting decides, but I'm saying that we've got to recommend a budget that makes sense in our mind, right? So and that's, I think, was the point of that. What Dan's saying is, hey, we may not use any of that stuff, but hey, especially now, given that the schools are going to be deciding possibly very last minute, right? All departments should think that way. And again, not in anticipation that we're going to take things away, but hey, when we're sitting there at the last minute, is there, if we have to do something, and again, this is not excluding Travis. Travis is part of this conversation as well. But ultimately, Travis, as the representative of the select board, has to know what the select board's priorities are to represent those when we're having the discussions. So okay. Just to be clear, so yes, they've given us everything. What we're asking for, or what Dan's asking for, is give us the broad strokes of what's most important, what's least important, so that if adjustments have to be made, we make them in the areas you consider least important.
Sure.
Yeah. So, okay, Michelle, and then I'll get to Tina.
I just want to explain to Mark. So Mark, when town meeting votes, they vote line items, and only town meeting could change the line items, except we have a power at the end of the fiscal year. We can change line items in order to balance budgets, except for the schools. When the school budget is voted, it's a bottom line. So when we ask someone to set a priority, it's because we don't want to cut from like personal services if they'd rather cut from professional services.
So Mark, are you in, where do you come out on this?
So I have no issue with what you're asking for. Is getting, I guess I'm thinking about it backwards from what you are all thinking. So sorry about that. I'm good at backwards thinking. Yeah, so I do think having the priorities in that sense, that would be the understood sense would be a much smarter thing to go with, rather than just arbitrarily kind of as not that Travis did this, but that instead of just backing into some random number, just actually having an idea.
Well, as I said, I think it's more of a preparatory exercise than anything. But Tina, go ahead. You had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the select board is going to be respectful of the finance committee's opinion. And if this is something that you're asking for, I think it's going to get serious consideration. I do stand by my comment last night that I didn't hear it coming from last week. I hear it coming tonight. Fair enough. But I just want to go back to the fall to some finance committee meetings and sort of general consensus at that time, which was pretty much a directive, which I took seriously, to the select board to vote their priorities in the budgets that they approved. I mean, I definitely remember that conversation. So for me, again, looking at the budget that the town administrator is presenting to the select board, that is the advice we've followed all along, is to vote the priorities that we see in the budgets that come to us. And I believe that's what we presented through the town administrator to the finance committee. So just as a little bit of a why we're here today, we were tasked by the finance committee to do the very thing that we did, which was, again, vote our priorities. I'm not looking for an argument or a disagreement with how you feel. I think you guys have reached a consensus tonight, and that will be respected and considered by the select board. But where I sit and what I brought to my decisions when I was reviewing budgets was the request of the finance committee, which was to vote the priorities that the select board felt. And I believe that's what we've done. So I just wanted to say that. And then, I am hopeful, Ken, to come back to your earlier comment in the meeting in terms of getting to some alignment, getting to what all believe is the bottom line. I'm hopeful that's still an ongoing process in terms of line 55 on the spreadsheet that you had up there, that they're, still ongoing, that the alignment is still occurring to get to the CapEx number that everybody can agree on.
Look,
so.
The fact of the matter is, this is the process we use every year. I know that.
Sure, I understand.
We start out, with a bunch of budget requests. That gives us a certain bottom line number, and then we start looking at how we get to a budget from there, right? But just to be clear, I think I do think, and I'm not. This is in no way a criticism of what the select board has done in terms of their budgets, right? You guys can request whatever you want. I think that you did vote budgets that reflect all of the priorities that you have, right? And I think that just to be clear about what is meant by priorities, this gets back to what Mark was saying, right? When the school comes to us with a budget, they may sit there and they say, okay, here's a number we're requesting. And that includes the top, all these 10 priorities that we have, these initiatives. And that's a good example, right? Let's forget about this year. Let's go back to pre-COVID, right? They would vote a budget and they'd say, okay, we have, we'd like this much extra money, or, when I say extra, I mean above level service, right? To implement certain initiatives. And if we sat there and said, okay, well, look, we don't have enough money to support all of these. So if you could, it would be helpful to say, okay, of these initiatives you had, which ones are the ones you consider most important? Because if we can find enough money to get, let's say you had 10 and we could fund 6 of them, we want to know which 6 you'd want funding for, right? Now, ultimately, in the school's case, right, they can spend, they have rules about their spending, but obviously that guides us or helps us say, okay, well, geez, if these are the most important things for them, we can find the money, let's do that. That's sure. So I think that's what I'm saying. I think that we're in kind of phase 2, which is you've got all your priorities in there. And now we're kind of saying, okay, if we need to look at not being able to do everything, what do you think is most important? And that's
fair enough. I hear what you're saying. I guess for me, the thing that's missing for me is again, have we reached an alignment on what the bottom line is? If the answer is yes, okay. If the answer is no, this is, I don't know, maybe this is not premature because I take the point that we only have 2 meetings left. I understand the clock is ticking here, but has the bottom line been agreed upon?
Right, and no, obviously it's not, because you heard the conversation tonight, right? So again, it's more preparatory than anything, right? If we reach alignment on a bottom line that allows funding of all the priorities, then we're fine, right? But if we don't, or if we reach alignment on something that doesn't allow funding of all the priorities, then we have to have that conversation, and that's why. Sure, but sorry, Ken, I don't mean to interrupt, but I think the bottom line comment was, if I understood correctly, was in terms of that capital number. Well, yeah, go round and round on it. Budgetable, so you could point to any line in the budget and say this is where the discrepancies are, right? But but the bottom line is not agreed on. That's the thing. Dan, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond to Tina, I mean, no one is saying that you guys haven't put out what you want as your priorities. That's, I mean, clearly you have, and I'm not necessarily even disputing the validity, my view of them. A lot of them make a lot of sense to me. But as we've sort of discussed, though, I think that it's going to be impossible for us to have the bottom line sort of even finalized, because there are a number of things that are outstanding that are beyond our control currently, and movement in those numbers could have significant dramatic shifts to everyone's views on different needs and different things. But what we want is to have all the data up front. So you have a bunch of priorities and things that you've laid out as a board, and all we're saying is rank them. What is your favorite child, basically?
I love all my children equally.
Well,
differently.
you do, but sometimes you're going to have to pick one if the boat's sinking to say no. But anyway, no. I mean, but it's
Each cat's on the line. You're not getting me to say that.
Okay,
don't take it deeper there, Dan.
No, okay, but no, but I mean, all we're saying is come up with some sort of idea to help us. And look, if you don't want to prioritize, is it? I mean, somehow you have to sort of see where it is, because if we say that, or if we think that there's going to be needs to pull back on some of the spending in certain areas, and I wanted this from all departments too. Again, that's why I asked if Travis would help us go through the stuff that maybe isn't necessarily under their department, and that may free up some additional monies for.
And just to be clear, since I know we've gotten some people have said the people get treated differently, this request has already been made of the school department. Right. This is something we discussed with the budget subcommittee, in one of our liaison meetings. Was, they have new initiatives, they have other things that we kind of said to them the same thing, which is what's most important, because if we get to a point where we have to start looking at that, we want to know what their thinking is there too. So it's not meant to be just the select board. We ask this of usually of every department. What are these things, and obviously in a lot of cases. Travis coordinates that for us, right? But
I hear you. Yep. Okay.
Just to reiterate, because I just want to make this very clear, just because we're making this request does not mean that we will make the request to actually axe things. So like that just please don't look at this as like you're actually putting, if the thing that you rank lowest is automatically gone. Like that's not necessarily the intent or the desire. It's just, we just want to have the information to make the best decision so that everybody gets as much of their most priorities prioritized. And
the highest priorities. Yeah. Anyway.
And
go ahead, Michelle.
It's a matter of equity too. I mean, how does it look if we ask every department except for the departments under the select board what their priorities are?
So, okay. Well, I think your message now, Tina, do you believe that the message is clear, or do you want us to take a formal vote to request it, or
I don't think we need a formal vote. No, I think your comments are loud and clear.
Okay, just want to make sure. Okay, so where do we go from here? I think the answer is we'll have more conversations with Travis. I know that I'm certainly going to talk to him over the next week. There are lots of things. Travis and I generally meet weekly, if not more frequently as necessary, to discuss where we're going. But I think that, obviously the delay in the schools is going to make things pretty interesting. I think that, it's like the 14th was workable, the 28th is workable, but with a lot higher stress level at the end. So we'll have to see where that goes. But yes, go ahead, Travis.
Not just the schools.
Oh yes, I know. So yeah, so there are other things that are outstanding. So it's going to be a fun home stretch this year.
Well, they don't have a decision. We just get to turn around and say you get.
And what I would say is just given that we haven't had this for a couple of years, we'll blame Travis. No, just kidding. His first year, and he's taken us right down to the wire. So,
you get what you get, and you don't get upset.
That's right. So anyway, so what I would encourage the committee to do is look over the spreadsheet, think about where we want to go from here. Obviously, as I've pointed out 20 times, Travis is obviously an integral part of this discussion as well. So I think that, yes, go ahead, Michelle.
So what happens if there is no finalization of contracts by the time the warrant closes?
Well, there are a number of options. Obviously, town meeting appropriates money, right? That's town meeting's purview. we would have to recommend a budget, and we'd have to discuss what our, again, at the end of the day, the 7 of us have to vote a recommended budget, right? How we do that and what we put in there, we can go to the town and say, hey, look, this balances, but there's this issue, or we can say, this is what we've modeled for this. I mean, it all depends on what the situation is at the time. But at the end of the day, we have to recommend a balanced budget to the town meeting. If the contracts settle afterwards, we'd have to adjust in October if we didn't have it already covered in the budget.
Right. 3 years ago, for one of these, for example, a contract essentially not being done by the time the budget was settled required a supplemental budget appropriation at the following fall town meeting, which required that, by the way, excess levy capacity was available to accomplish that. And so those are realistic scenarios, given the two outstanding at the moment.
Right. And just to be clear, I want to emphasize one thing Travis just said, right? When it was dealt with in the past, it was dealt with excess levy capacity, which is that bottom line number, right? We have a number of contracts outstanding. So I think that when thinking about the spreadsheet, that's definitely a consideration as well. Because if it does turn into a situation where the negotiations take more time than we have, we go to town meeting in May, we don't have the final numbers, then I think it's more incumbent, and this is a discussion we'll have probably over the next couple of weeks, is how much capacity, if these things don't settle out in the next few weeks, how much capacity do we leave? Meaning we don't run that bottom line to zero, right? So that's and that's something I think that once the liaisons get together with the school budget subcommittee and we try to get some feeling for that, and then the other contracts that are outstanding, that might guide where we want to leave capacity at the bottom if things aren't settled by then. So.
And then people faint when they get their tax bills in the middle of the year.
That's right. Well, that's why I always told you, I said, the funniest, just a quick digression, right? I always laugh when people take surveys and they go up to people and say, would you like this? Would you like this? Would you like this? And everybody says, yeah, we want this. And then when you change the question to, would you like this? And this is how much it's going to cost you on your tax bill. Then suddenly they're looking at it a little differently and saying, well, maybe I don't want to spend that much on that. So that's where survey data, always has to be taken with a grain of salt, because these things don't come for free. So anyway, okay, so any other discussion on FY22? I think the assignment for the committee this week is to go look at that spreadsheet, formulate your own scenarios, and let's have a discussion next week. With some luck, maybe we'll have a stable warrant for I know that the select board is still working on that, where we can start discussing warrant articles. Yes, go ahead, Michelle.
Were we going to get a new stipend report, or are we just going to be meeting with them?
Yes, well, thank you for setting me up. That was a nice, lobbing it right to me here. Yes, during this meeting, the stipend committee was meeting again, and I received a text message, which is why I looked down at one point, from the chair of that committee requesting to get on our agenda that she had indicated that Joan indicated they updated their recommendation. So I will add them to the agenda for next week to give them the opportunity to talk to us about their updated recommendations.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else on FY22? Okay, I don't hear anything. Do you have any other last words? I see Travis shaking his head. He probably wants to, okay. With that, then we are at the close of the agenda. So I will I'll give everybody one last chance to say anything they want to say. Otherwise, I'll entertain the motion.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Okay, that is not subject to debate. Mr. Alfred?
Yes.
Mr. Maxwell?
Yes.
Ms. Zemer?
Yes.
Ms. Nersessian?
Yes.
Mr. Whitaker?
Yes.
Mr. Murphy?
Yes.
And I vote yes. That concludes the Tuesday, April 6th meeting of the Finance Committee. Thank you for joining us this evening. Our next meeting will be next Tuesday, April 13th at 7 p.m. We will again be meeting virtually, but for tonight we're done. So thank you and good night.